Good morning. Um, I woke up late. Good morning. I woke up late. That's all I can say. I'm fucking stupid. Anyway, yes. Um. Good morning, everyone. I am Ariana Nuna. Uh, Today we are reading Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, Day 2, Afternoon, Mortimer's Dorset. I think I haven't even changed my Twitch title yet because I'm so useless. Hang on. Kazuo Ishiguro. Day 2. Afternoon. Mortimer Pond. Dorset. That. Oh. Okay, we have a follower that followed me yesterday, and they even cheered me 1,000 bits. Thank you so much. So the comment says, I've been reading along to your lonely castle in the mirror. Thank you for uploading so many hours. I'm not great at reading and trying to get back to it. I doubt I'll be able to catch your stream because your time zone is like 3 in the morning here in London. I hope life is treating you well and will be going through more of your Noodibles. You really deserve more followers. You spend a lot of time doing this and hope you grow as time goes by. Hope you are as happy. Hope you are happy and healthy. Oh my God, Dimitri! They even sub with Prime. Oh my God! I have to send Dimitri a message. Aww, guys. Man, I really don't need you guys to sub or anything. Like, as long as you guys are here, listen to me, or even just go to my previous, like, highlighted stream and, you know, and listen to it, that I'll be happy enough. Sorry, I've been quiet because I've been replying to someone who followed me yesterday, and they told me that they uh, read the book Lonely Castle in the Mirror, following my reading. I'm so happy and glad that people actually enjoyed it. You guys don't have to pay me, don't have to sub to me. Just follow me and listen to me, and I'll be happy enough to do whatever I do. Really, yeah. Um, okay, so I started a little bit late today because I'm stupid and I woke up late. My alarm rang for like a million times, yet I still wake up at 10:45. I would love to eat my toasted bread here, if you don't mind me, for a bit before we start reading. Today's reading is not going to be super long compared to the last one because the pacing is a bit weird. So it's gonna be a bit okay, but on Friday reading it'll be like really long. Oh my god. Oh, there's the end over there. Oh, thank you, DM. I was ready to put up for PDF actually, but I was thinking if I'm eating now, best if I just don't put first. But it's okay. Everyone can listen to my bread chewing sound. I'm sure there's a market for that. People eating loudly into the microphone. I was like a bit surprised, yes, like because someone joined our Discord yesterday, and then I was like, hey, that's weird. But I didn't check my Twitch because like I have started to let go of the thought mukbang stream fine. I cannot because I can't show my face. I can't show my face, that's why there's no mukbang stream. But next month when I'm having my holiday, 3 weeks holiday, I'll definitely be doing stream, uh IRL stream, but I won't show you guys my face. I'll show you guys the food that I eat, okay? I'm so happy that she or he, I don't know, I'm not sure, enjoyed my reading. This is exactly why I highlight and save every single reading I have, because first of all, it's hard work, super hard work. Reading all of them through a hard work, okay? Secondly, someone can always like, go to my previous stuff and and watch them, or in this case, listen to them. I'm sorry, I'm chewing my bread live on stream. But I need to eat something before I start, otherwise I'll be grumpy. This book is really good so far, I would say. I really like it. I have a bookmark that says, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. It's pretty good stuff. I have so many bookmarks, I don't even know what bookmarks are where. I have a really, really good one. Where is it? Some bookmarks are exceptionally good, and I enjoy them. I got some like really nice stickers as bookmark as well. Ah, where did that one go? It must be like in one of these books. It's okay. Is my phone ringing? Guys, do you guys have like succulent plants at home? I don't know why mine keep dying. I don't have green thumb. Sorry, I'm not reading yet. I'm eating bread. Drinking my coffee. Give me a moment, okay? Don't rush me. I'm rushing myself. I'm thinking what book to read next. I think The Cat That Saved the... I think the next one should be The Cat Who Saved Books. Cat Who Saved Books. It's been there in front of me, so I really want to read it. And after that, we'll go back to Natsume Soseki. I don't know how much you guys like Soseki, but I love him. So I don't really care if you guys like him or not. I love him, and that's all that matters. Well, the good thing is nobody walked in yet from the party finder. Oh my god! Don't talk when you're eating! Luna. Bad manners. I have 23 videos on Natsume Soseki. I should do more IRL stream, huh? Like when I'm walking around somewhere. But not in my country because I don't want to be killed or murdered. Um, anyway, I'm ready to read now. I'm gonna put my bread away. I know. Shame. Can't finish my bread. One more bite. No, a bakery near me makes this really good seaweed butter. Yeah, serious seaweed butter. They're really good. That's all I want to say about it. They're really good. Seaweed butter. Okay, let's go, guys. Diane has missed like the entire 3 chapters. It was like super long, 4 hours long reading. It's insane. But that was the pace of the book, so I couldn't really like not couldn't like just like stop in the middle of a chapter and something like that. Okay. Okay. Phone is on silent. No distraction. Yeah, let's go. The end. Today we are reading Natsume. Sorry. Today we are reading Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. Day 2. Afternoon. Mortimer's Pond, Dorset. I apologize for in advance for any mispronunciation. English is indeed my second language, and there are some words that are quite difficult to pronounce in this book because it's very British. Alrighty, a sip of coffee. Let's go. It would seem there's a whole dimension to the question, what is a great butler? I have hitherto not properly considered. It is, I must say, a rather unsettling experience to realize about this matter so close to my heart, particularly one I have given much thought over the years. But it strikes me I may have been a little hasty before in dismissing certain aspects of the Hay Society's criteria for membership. I have no wish, let me make clear, to retract any of my ideas on dignity and its crucial link to greatness. But I have been thinking a little bit more about the other pronouncement made by the Hay Society. Hang on. Forgot lip balm. Lip balm is crucial when you're reading out loud. Anyway. Namely, the admission that it was a prerequisite for membership of the society that the applicant be attached to a distinguished household. My feelings remain no less than before that this represents a piece of unthinking snobbery on the part of the society. However, it occurs to me that perhaps what one takes objection to is specifically the outmoded understanding of what a distinguished household is, rather than the general principle being expressed. Indeed, now that I think further on the matter, I believe it may well be true to say it is a prerequisite of greatness that one be attached to a distinguished household. So long one takes distinguished here to have a meaning deeper than understood by the Hay Society. In fact, a comparison of how I might interpret a distinguished household with what the Hay Society understood by the term illuminates sharply, I believe, the fundamental difference between the values of our generation of butlers and those of the previous generation. When I say this, I am not merely drawing attention to the fact that our generation has a less snobbish attitude as regards which employers were landed gentry and which were business. What I'm trying to say, and I do not think this an unfair comment, is that we were much more idealistic generation. Where our elders might have been concerned with whether or not an employer was titled or otherwise from one of those old families, we tended to concern ourselves much more with the moral status of an employer. I do not mean by this that we were preoccupied with our employer's private behavior. What I mean is that we were ambitious in a way that would have been unusual a generation before. To serve gentlemen who were, so to speak, furthering the progress of humanity, it would have been seen as far worthier calling, for instance, to serve a gentleman, his such as Mr. George Kettridge, who, however humble his beginnings, has made an undeniable contribution to the future well-being of the empire, than any gentleman, however aristocratic his origin, who idled away his time in clubs or on golf courses. In practice, of course, many gentlemen from the noblest family have tended to devote themselves to alleviating the great problems of the day, and so, at a glance, it may have appeared that the ambitions of our generation differed little from those of our predecessors. But I can vouch there was a crucial distinction in attitude, reflected not only in the sort of things you would hear fellow professionals express to each other, but in the way many of the most able persons of our generation chose to leave one position for another. Such decisions were no longer a matter simply of wages, the size of staff at one's disposal, or the splendor of a family name. For our generation, I think it is fair to say professional prestige lay most significantly in the moral worth of one's employer. I believe I can best highlight the difference between the generations by expressing myself figuratively. Butlers of my father's generation, I would say, tended to see the world in terms of a ladder. The houses of royalty, dukes and the lords, from the oldest families placed at the top, those of new money lower down, and so on, until one reached a point below which the hierarchy was determined simply by wealth, or the lack of it. Any butler with ambition simply did his best to climb as high up this ladder as possible, and by and large, the larger he went, the greater his professional prestige. Such are, of course, precisely the values embodied in the Hay Society idea of distinguished household, and the fact that it was confidently making such pronouncements as late as 1929 shows clearly why the demise of the society was inevitable, if not long overdue. For by that time, such thinking was quite out of step with that of the finest men emerging to the forefront of our profession. For our generation, I believe it is accurate to say, viewed the world not as a ladder, but more as a wheel. Perhaps I might explain this further. It is my impression that our generation was the first to recognize something which had passed the notice of all earlier generations, namely the great decisions of the world are not, in fact, arrived at simply in the public chambers, or else during a handful of days given over to the international conference under the full gaze of the public and the press. Rather, debates are conducted and crucial decisions arrived at in the privacy and calm of the great houses of this country. What occurs under the public gaze with so much pomp and ceremony is often the conclusion or mere ratification of what has taken place over weeks or months within these walls of such houses. To us, then, the world was a wheel revolving with these great houses at the hub, their mighty decisions emanating out to all else, rich and poor, which revolve around them. It was the aspiration of all those of us with professional ambition to work our way as close to this hub as we were each of us capable. For we were, as I say, an idealistic generation for whom the question was not simply one of how well one practiced one's skills, but to what end one did so, and each of us harbored the desire to make our own small contribution to the creation of a better world, and saw that, as professionals, the surest means of doing so would be to serve the great gentlemen of our times in whose hands civilization had been entrusted. Of course, I am now speaking out in broad generalization, and I would readily admit there was all too many persons of our generation who had no patience for such finer considerations. Conversely, I am sure there were many of my father's generation who recognized instinctively this moral dimension to their work, but by and large, I believe these generalization to be accurate, and indeed, such idealistic motivation as I have described have played a large part in my own career. I myself moved quite rapidly from employer to employer during my early career, being aware that this situation were incapable of bringing me lasting satisfaction before being rewarded at last with the opportunity to serve Lord Darlington. It is curious that I have never until today thought of matters of this in these terms. Indeed, that through all those many hours we spent discussing the nature of greatness by the fire of our servants' hall, the likes of Mr. Graham and I never considered this whole dimension to the question. And while I would not retract anything I have previously stated regarding the quality of dignity, I must admit there is something to the argument that whatever the degree to which Butler has attained such a quality, if he has failed to find an appropriate outlet for his accomplishment, he can hardly expect his fellows to consider him great. Certainly, it is observable that figures like Mr. Marshall and Mr. Lane have served only gentlemen of indisputable moral stature. Lord Wakeling, Lord Camberley, Sir Leonard Grey, and one cannot help get the impression that they simply would not have offered their talents to gentlemen of lesser caliber. Indeed, the more one considers it, the more obvious it seems. Association with a truly distinguished household is a prerequisite of greatness. A great butler can only be, surely, one who can point to his years of service and say that he has applied his talents to serving a great gentleman, and through that latter, to serving humanity. As I say, I have never in all these years thought of the matter in quite this way. But then, it is perhaps in the nature of coming away on a trip such as this that one is prompted towards such surprising new perspectives on topics one imagined one had long ago thought through thoroughly. I have also no doubt been prompted to think along such lines by the small events that occurred an hour or so ago, which has, I admit, unsettled me somewhat. Having enjoyed a good morning's motoring in splendid weather and having lunch well in the country inn, I had just crossed the border into Dorset. It was then I had become aware of the heated smell emanating from the car engine. The thought that I had done some damage to my employer's Ford was, of course, most alarming, and I had quickly brought the vehicle to a halt. I found myself in a narrow lane, hemmed in on either side by foliage, so that I could gain little idea of what was around me. Neither could I see far ahead, the lane winding quite sharply 20 yards or so in front. It occurred to me that I could not remain where I was for long without incurring the risk of an incoming vehicle coming round the same bend and colliding into my employer's Ford. I thus started the engine again, and partially reassured to find the smell seemed not as powerful as before. A sip of coffee. My best course, I could see, was to look for a garage, or else a large house of a gentleman where there would be a good chance I might find a chauffeur who could see what the matter was. But the lane continued to wind for some distance, and the high hedge on either side of me also persisted, obscuring my vision so that though I passed several gates, some of which clearly yielded on to driveways, I was unable to glimpse the houses themselves. I continued another half-mile or so, the disturbing smell now growing stronger by the moment, until at last I came out on the stretch of the open road. I could now see some distance before me, and indeed, ahead to my left there loomed a tall Victorian house with a substantial front lawn and what was clearly a driveway converted from an old carriage track. As I drew up to it, I was encouraged further to glimpse a Bentley through the open doors of a garage attached to the main house. The gate, too, had been left open, and so I steered the Ford a little way up the drive, got out, and made my way to the back of the door of the house. This was opened by a man dressed in his shirt sleeve, wearing no tie, but who, upon my asking for the chauffeur of the house, replied cheerfully that I had hit the jackpot this first time. On hearing of my problem, the man, without hesitation, came out to the Ford, opened the bonnet, and informed me that after a barely few seconds inspection, "Water, Gov? You need some water in your radiator." He seemed to be rather amused by the whole situation, but was obliging enough. He returned inside the house, and after a few moments, he emerged again with a jug of water and a funnel. As he filled the radiator, his head bent over the engine. He began to chat amiably, and on ascertaining that I was undertaking a motoring tour of the area, recommended I visit a local beauty spot, a certain pond not half a mile away. I had in the meantime more opportunity to observe the house. It was taller than it was broad, comprising 4 floors with ivy covering much of the front right up to the gables. I could see from its windows, however, that at least half of it was dust-sheeted. I remarked on this to the man once he had finished the radiator and closed the bonnet. "A shame, really," he said. "It's a lovely house. Through this Colonel trying to sell the place off. He ain't got much use for a house this size now." I could not help inquiring then how many staff were employed there, and I suppose I was hardly surprised to told that there was only himself and a cook who came in each evening. He was, it seemed, a butler, valet, chauffeur, and a general cleaner. He had been the Colonel's batman in the war, he explained. They had been in Belgium together when the Germans had invaded, and they had been together again for the Allied landing. Then he regarded me carefully and said, "Now I got it. I couldn't make you out for a while, but now I got it. You're one of those top-notch butlers from one of them big posh houses." When I told him he was not far off the mark, he continued, "Now I got it. Couldn't make you out for a while, see? 'Cause you talk almost like a gentleman. And with what you are driving an old beauty like this," he gestured to the Ford, "I thought at first, here's a really posh geezer. And so you are, Gov. Really posh, I mean. I never learnt any of that myself, you see. I'm just a plain old batman gone civvy." He then asked me where it was I was employed, and when I told him, he leaned his head to one side with a quizzical look. "Darlington Hall," he said to himself. "Darlington Hall. Must be a really posh place. It rings a bell even to an idiot like yours truly. Darlington Hall. Hang on. You don't mean Darlington Hall, Lord Darlington's place?" "It was Lord Darlington's residence until his death 3 years ago," I informed him. "The house is now the residence of Mr. John Faraday, an American gentleman." "You really must be top-notch working in a place like that. Can't be many like you left, eh?" Then his voice changed noticeably as he inquired, "You mean you actually used to work for Lord Darlington?" He was eyeing me carefully again. I said, "Oh no. I'm employed by Mr. John Faraday, the American gentleman who bought the house from the Darlington family." "Oh, so you wouldn't have known that Lord Darlington. Just that I wondered what he was like, what sort of bloke he was." I told the man that I would have to be on my way and thank him empathetically for his assistance. He was, after all, an amiable fellow, taking the trouble to guide me in reversing out the gateway before I parted. He bent down and recommended again that I visit the local pond, repeating his instructions as to how I would find it. "It's a beautiful little spot," he added. "You'll kick yourself for missing it. In fact, the Colonel's doing a bit of fishing there this minute." The fort seemed to be in fine form again, and since the pond in question was but a small detour off my route, I decided to take up the Batman's suggestion. His direction had seemed clear enough, but once I had turned off the main road, and in an attempt to follow them, I found myself getting lost in narrow, twisting lanes like the one in which I had first noticed the alarming smell. At times, the foliage on either side became so thick as one practically to blot out the sun altogether, but one found one's eyes struggling to cope with the sudden contrast of the bright sunlight and deep shade. Suddenly, however, after some searching, I found a signpost to Mortimer's pond, and it was so that I arrived here at the little spot a little over half an hour ago. I now found myself much indebted to the Batman, for quite aside from assisting with the fort, he has allowed me to discover a most charming spot with which it is most improbable I would ever have found otherwise. The pond is not a large one, a quarter of a mile around its perimeter perhaps, so that by stepping out of promontory one can command a view of its entirety. An atmosphere of great calm pervades there. Trees have been planted all around the water just closely enough to give a pleasant shade to the banks, while here and there the clusters of tall reeds and bulrushes break the water surface and its still reflection of the sky. My footwear is not such as to permit me walk easily around the perimeter. I can see even from where I now sit the path disappearing into areas deep mud. But I will say that such is the charm of this spot that on first arriving, I was sorely tempted to do just that. Only the thought of possible catastrophes might befall such an expedition, and of sustaining damage to my travelling suit, persuaded me to content myself with sitting here on this bench. And so I have done for the past half hour, contemplating the progress of the various figures seated quietly with their fishing rods at various points around the water. At this point, I can see a dozen or so such figures, but the strong lights and shades created by the low-hanging branches prevent me from making any of them out clearly, and I had to forego small game I had been anticipating of guessing which of these fishermen is the colonel of the whole house I have just received such useful assistance. It is no doubt the quiet of these surroundings that has enabled me to ponder all the more thoroughly these thoughts which have entered my mind over the past half hour or so. Indeed, but for the tranquillity of the present setting, it is possible I would not have thought a great deal further about my behaviour during my encounter with the Batman. That is to say, I may not have thought further why it was that I had given the distinct impression I had ever been in the employ of Lord Darlington, for surely there's no real doubt that is what occurred. He had asked, "You mean you actually work for that Lord Darlington?" And I had given an answer which could mean little other than that I had not. It could simply be that a meaningless whim had suddenly overtaken me at that moment, but it is hardly a convincing way to account for such distinct odd behaviour. In any case, I have now come to accept that incident with the Batman is not the first of its kind. Therefore, there is little doubt it has some connection, though I am not quite clear of the nature of it, with what occurred a few months ago during the visits of the Wakefields. Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield are an American couple who have been settled in England, somewhere in Kent, I understand, for some 20 years. Having a number of acquaintances in common with Mr. Faraday, amidst Boston society, they paid a short visit one day to the Darlington Hall, staying for lunch and leaving before tea. I now refer to a time only a few weeks after Mr. Faraday had arrived at the house, a time when his enthusiasm for his acquisition was at a height. Consequently, much to the Wakefields' visit was taken up with my employer leading them on what might have seemed to some unnecessary extensive tour of the premises, including all the dust-sheeted areas. Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield, however, appeared to be keen on the inspection as Mr. Faraday, and as I went about my business, I would often catch various American exclamations of delight coming from whichever part of the house they had arrived at. Mr. Faraday had commenced the tour at the top of the house, and by the time he had brought his guest down to inspect the magnificence of the ground floor rooms, he seemed to be on an elevated plane, pointing out details of the cornicing and window frames and describing with some flourish what the English lords used to do in each room. Although, of course, I made no deliberate attempt to overhear, I could not help but get the gist of what was being said, and was surprised by the extent of my employer's knowledge, which, despite the occasional infelicity, betrayed a deep enthusiasm for English ways. It was noticeable, however, that the Wakefields, Mrs. Wakefield in particular, were themselves by no means ignorant of the traditions of our country, and one gathered from the many remarks they made that they too were owners of an English house of some splendor. It was at a certain stage during this tour of the premises I was crossing the hall under the impression that the party had gone out to explore the grounds, when I saw that Mrs. Wakefield had remained behind and closely examining the stone arch that frames the doorway into the dining room. As I went past, muttering a quiet "Excuse me, madam," she turned and said, "Oh, Stevens! Perhaps... Oh, there you go. Hey, Fizz, haven't seen you in a bit. Thank you for coming." She turned around and said, "Oh, Stevens, perhaps you're the one to tell me. This ark here looks 17th century, but isn't it the case that it was built quite recently? Perhaps during Lord Darlington's time?" "It is possible, madam. It's very beautiful. But it is probably a kind of mock period piece done only a few years ago, isn't that right?" "I'm not sure, madam, but that is certainly possible." Then, lowering her voice, Mrs. Wakefield had said, "But tell me, Stevens, what was this Lord Darlington like? Presumably you must work for him." "I didn't, madam. No." "Oh, I thought you did. I wonder why I thought that." Mrs. Wakefield turned back to the ark and putting her hand to it and said, "So we don't know for certain, then. Still, it looks to me like it's a mock. Very skillful, but mock." It is possible I might have quickly forgotten this exchange, however, following the Wakefield's departure. I took in afternoon tea to Mr. Faraday in the drawing room and noticed he was in a rather preoccupied mood. After an initial silence, he said, "You know, Stevens, Mrs. Wakefield wasn't as impressed with this house as I believe she ought to have been." "Is that so, sir?" "In fact, she seemed to think that I was exaggerating the pedigree of this place, that I was making it up about all these features going back centuries." "Indeed, sir?" She kept asserting everything was mock this and mock that. She even thought you were a mock, Stevens." "Indeed, sir." "Indeed, Stevens. I told her that you were a real thing, a real old English butler, that you have been in this house for over 30 years, serving a real English lord, but Mrs. Wakefield contradicted me on this point. In fact, she contradicted me with great confidence." "Is that so, sir?" "Mrs. Wakefield, Stevens, was convinced you never worked here until I hired you. In fact, she seemed to be under the impression she had heard that from your own lips. Made me look pretty much a fool, as you can imagine." "It is most regrettable, sir." "I mean to say, Stevens, this is a genuine old grand English house, isn't it? That's what I paid for. And you're a genuine old-fashioned English butler, not just some waiter pretending to be one. You're the real thing, aren't you? That's what I wanted. Isn't that what I have?" "I venture to say that you do, sir. Then can you explain to me what Mrs. Wakefield is saying? It's a big mystery to me." "It is possible I may have given the lady a slightly misleading picture concerning my career, sir. I do apologize if this caused embarrassment." I'll say it does cause embarrassment. Those people have now got me down for a braggart and a liar. Anyway, what do you mean you may have given her a slightly misleading picture? I'm very sorry, sir, but I have no idea I might cause you such embarrassment. But damn it, Stevens! Why did you tell her such a tale? I considered the situation for a moment, then said, I'm very sorry, sir, but it is to do with the ways of this country. What are you talking about, man? I mean to say, sir, that it is not customary in England for an employee to discuss his past employers. Okay, Stevens, so you don't wish to divulge past confidences, but does that extend to you actually denying having worked for anyone other than me? It does seem a little extreme when you put it that way, sir, but it has often been considered desirable for employees to give such impression. If I may put it this way, sir, it is a little akin to the custom as regards marriages. If a divorced lady were present in the company of her second husband, it is often thought desirable not to allude to the original marriage at all. There is a similar custom as regards of our profession, sir. Well, I only wish I had known about your customs before, Stevens, my employer said, leaning back in his chair. It certainly made me look like a chump. I believe I realized even at that time that my explanation to Mr. Faraday, though of course not entirely devoid of truth, was woefully inadequate. But when one has so much else to think about, it is easy not to give such matters a great deal of attention, and so I did, indeed, put the whole episode out of my mind for some time. But now, recalling it here in the calm that surrounds this pond, there seems little doubt that my conduct towards Mrs. Wakefield that day had an obvious relation to what had just taken place this afternoon. Of course, there are many people these days who have a lot of foolish things to say about Lord Darlington, and it may be that you are under the impression that I am somehow embarrassed or ashamed of my association with his lordship, and it is this that lies behind such conduct. But let me make it clear that nothing could be further from the truth. The great majority of one who hears about his lordship today is, in my case, utter nonsense, based on an almost complete ignorance of the fact. Indeed, it seems to me that my conduct can be very plausibly explained in the terms of my wish to avoid any possibility of hearing any further such nonsense concerning his lordship. That is to say, I have chosen to tell white lies in both instances as the simplest means to avoid unpleasantness. This does seem very plausible. This does seem a very plausible explanation the more I think about it, for it is true. Nothing vexes me more these days than to hear this sort of nonsense being repeated. Let me say that Lord Darlington was a gentleman of great moral stature, a stature that dwarfs most of those persons you may find talking this sort of nonsense about him, and I will readily vouch that he remained that to the last. Nothing could be less accurate than to suggest that I regret my association with such a gentleman. Indeed, you will appreciate to have to serve his lordship at the Darlington Hall during those years was to come as close to the hub of this world's wheel as one such as I could ever have dreamt. I gave 35 years' service to Lord Darlington. One would surely not be unjustified in claiming that during those years one was, in the truest term, attached to a distinguished household. In looking back over my career thus far, my chief satisfaction derives from what I achieved during those years, and I am today nothing but proud and grateful to have been given such a privilege. Day 3. Morning. Taunton, Somerset. Taunton, Somerset. 1 second for coffee. We are continuing. Wait, hang on. We are continuing The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Day 3, morning, Taunton, Somerset. Somerset. I lodged last night in an inn named Coach and Horses a little way outside the town of Taunton, Somerset. This being a thatched roof cottage by the roadside, it had looked a conspicuously attractive prospect from the fort as I had approached in the last of daylight. The landlord led me up a timber stairway to a small room, rather bare, but perfectly decent. When he inquired whether I had dined, I asked him to serve me with a sandwich in my room, which proved a perfect satisfactory option as far as supper was concerned. But then, as the evening drew on, I began to feel a little restless in my room, and in the end, I decided to descend to the bar below to try a little of the local cider. There were 5 or 6 gentlemen all gathered in a group around the bar. One guessed from their appearance they were agricultural people of one sort or another, but otherwise the room was empty. Acquiring a tankard of cider from the landlord, I seated myself at the table a little way away, intending to relax a little and collect my thoughts concerning the day. It soon became clear, however, that these local people were perturbed by my presence, feeling something of a need to show hospitality. Whenever there was a break in their conversation, one or the other of them would steal a glance in my direction, as though trying to find it in himself to approach me. Eventually, one even raised his voice and said to me, "It seems you have let yourself for a night upstairs here, sir." When I told him this was so, the speaker shook his head doubtfully and remarked, "You won't get much of a sleep up there, sir, not unless you are fond of the sound of the old Bob," he indicated the landlord, "banging away down here right way into the night, and then you will get woken up by his missus shouting at him right from the crack of dawn." Despite the landlord's protests, this caused a loud laughter all around. "Is that indeed so?" I said. And as I spoke, I was struck by the same thought as had struck me on numerous occasions of late, Mr. Faraday's presence, that some sort of witty retort was required of me. Indeed, the local people were now observing a polite silence, awaiting my next remark. I thus searched my imagination and eventually declared, "A local variation of the cock crow, no doubt." At first, the silence continued, as though the local person thought I intended to elaborate further, but then, noticing the mirthful expression on my face, they broke into a laugh, though in a somewhat bemused fashion. With this, they returned to their previous conversation, and I exchanged no further words with them until exchanging good nights a little while later. I had been rather pleased with my witticism when it had first came into my head. I must confess I was slightly disappointed it had not been better received than it was. I was particularly disappointed, I suppose, because I have been devoting some time and effort over recent months to improving my skills in this very area. That is to say, I have been endeavoring to add this skill to my professional armory so as to fulfill with confidence all Mr. Faraday's expectations with respect to bantering. For instance, I have of late taken to listening to the wireless in my room whenever I find myself with a few spare moments. On those occasions when Mr. Faraday is out for the evening, one program I listen to is called Twice a Week or More, which is in fact broadcast 3 times each week, and it basically comprises two persons making humorous comments on variety of topics raised by readers' letters. I have been studying this program because the witticism performed on it are always in the best of taste and, to my mind, of a tone not at all out of keeping with the sort of bantering Mr. Faraday might expect on my part. Taking on my cue from this program, taking my cue from this program, I have devised a simple exercise which I try to perform at least once a day. Whenever an odd moment presents itself, I attempt to formulate 3 witticisms based on my immediate surroundings at that moment. Or, as a variation of this same exercise, I may attempt to think of 3 witticisms based on the events of the past hour. You will perhaps appreciate that my disappointment concerning my witticism yesterday's evening. At first, I had thought it possible. At first, I had thought it possible to limited success was due to my not having spoken clearly enough. But then, the possibility occurred to me, once I had retired, that I might actually have given these people offense. After all, it could easily have been understood that I was suggesting the landlord's wife resembled a cockerel, an intention that had not remotely entered my head at that time. This thought continued to torment me as I tried to sleep, and I had half a mind to make an apology to the landlord this morning. But his mood towards me as she served breakfast seemed perfectly cheerful, and in the end I decided to let the matter rest. But this small episode is a good illustration as any of the hazards of uttering witticism. By the very nature of a witticism, one is given very little time to assess its various possible repercussions before one is called to give voice to it. And one gravely risks uttering all manner of unsuitable things if one has not first acquired the necessary skill and experience. There is no reason to suppose this is not an area in which I will become proficient given time and practice, but such are the dangers I have decided it best, for the time being at least, not to attempt to discharge this duty in respect of Mr. Faraday until I have practiced further. In any case, I am sorry to report that what the local people had themselves offered last night as witticism of sorts, the prediction that I would not have a good night owing to the disturbances from below, proved only to be true. The landlord's wife did not actually shout, but one could hear her talking incessantly both late into the night, and she and her husband went about their task, and again from very early this morning. I was quite prepared to forgive the couple, however, for it was clear they were of diligent, hard-working habits, and the noise, I am sure, was all attributable to this fact. Besides, of course, there had been the matter of my unfortunate remark. I thus gave no indication of having had a disturbed night when I thanked the landlord and took my leave to explore Market of the Taunton. Perhaps I might have done better to have lodged here in the establishment where I now sit enjoying a pleasant mid-morning cup of tea. For indeed, the notice outside advertises not only teas, snacks and cakes, but also clean, quiet and comfortable rooms. It is situated in the High Street of Taunton, very close to the Market Square, a somewhat sunken building. Its exterior characterized by heavy dark timber beams. I am at present sitting in its spacious room, oak panel, with enough tables to accommodate, I would guess, 24 people without a feeling of crowding. 2 cheery young girls serve from behind the counter, displaying a good selection of cakes and pastries. All in all, this is an excellent place to partake of morning tea, but surprisingly few of the inhabitants of Taunton seem to wish to avail themselves of it. At present, my only companion were 2 elderly ladies, sitting abreast one another at a table along the opposite wall, and a man, perhaps a retired farmer, at a table beside one of those large bay windows. I am unable to discern him clearly because the bright morning sunlight has for a moment reduced him to a silhouette, but I can see him studying his newspaper, breaking off regularly to look up at the passerby on the pavement outside. From the way he does this, I had thought at first that he was waiting for a companion, but it would seem he wishes merely to greet acquaintances as they pass by. I am myself ensconced almost at the back of the wall, but even across the distance of this room I can see clearly out into the sunlit street, and am able to make out on the pavement opposite the signpost, pointing out several nearby destinations. One of these destinations is the village of Merston. Perhaps Merston will ring a bell for you, as it did for me upon my first spotting on the road atlas yesterday. In fact, I must say I was even tempted to make a slight detour from my planned route just to see the village. Merston, Somerset, was where the firm of Giffen and Co. was once situated, and it was Merston one was required to dispatch one's order for supply of Giffen's dark candle of polish to be flaked, mixed into the wax, and applied by hand. For some time, Giffen's was undoubtedly the finest silver polish available, and it was the appearance of the new chemical substances on the market shortly before the war that caused demands of this impressive product to decline. As I remember, Giffen's appeared at the beginning of the 20s, as I am sure I am not alone in closely associating its emergence with a change of mood within our profession. That change which came to push the polishing of silver to the position of central importance it still by and large maintains today. This shift was, I believe, like so many other shifts around this period, a generational matter. It was during these years that our generation of butlers came of age, and figures like Mr. Marshall in particular played a crucial part in making silver polishing so central. This is not to suggest, of course, that the polishing of silver, particularly those items that would appear at the dinner table, was not always regarded as a serious duty, but it would not be unfair to suggest that many of butlers, say my father's generation, did not consider the matter such a key one, and this is evidenced in the fact that in those days the butler of the household rarely supervised the polishing of silver directly, being content to leave it so, say, to the under butler's whim, carrying out inspections only intermittently. It was Mr. Marshall, it is generally agreed, who was the first to recognize the full significance of silver, namely, that no other objects in the house were likely to come under such intimate scrutiny from outsiders as was silver during a meal, and as such, it served as a public index of a house standard. And Mr. Marshall, it was the first who caused stupefaction. Oh my God! It was Mr. Marshall. It was who first caused stupefaction. How do you pronounce that word? Hang on, let me Google it. Stupefaction. Sorry, English is my second language. And Mr. Marshall it was who first caused stupefaction amongst ladies and gentlemen visiting Charleville House with display of silver polish to previously unimagined standards. Very soon, naturally, butlers up and down the country, under pressure from their employers, were focusing their minds on the question of silver polishing. There quickly sprang up, I recall, various butlers, each claiming to have discovered methods by which they would surpass Mr. Marshall. Methods they made a great show of keeping secret, as though they were French chefs guarding their recipes. But I am confident, as I was then, that a sort of elaborate and mysterious processes performed by someone like Mr. Jack Neighbours had little or no discernible effect on the end result. As far as I was concerned, it was a simple enough matter. One used good polish, and one supervised closely. Giffen's was the polish ordered by all discerning butlers at the time, and if the product was used correctly, one had no fear of one's silver being second best to anybody's. I am glad to be able to recall numerous occasions when the silver at the Darlington Hall had a pleasing impact upon observers. For instance, I recall Lady Astor remarking, not without a certain bitterness, that our silver was probably unrivalled. I recall also watching Mr. George Bernard Shaw, the renowned playwright, at dinner one evening, examining closely to the dessert spoon before him, holding it up to the light and comparing its surface to that of a nearby platter, quite oblivious to the company around him. But perhaps the instance I recall with most satisfaction today concerns the night that a certain distinguished personage, a cabinet minister, shortly afterward to become a foreign secretary, paid a very off-the-record visit to the house. In fact, now that the subsequent fruits of those visits have become well documented, there seems little reason not to reveal that I am talking of Lord Halifax. As things turns out, that particular visit was simply the first of a whole series of unofficial meetings between Lord Halifax and the German ambassador at the time, Herr Ribbentrop. But how do you pronounce her? Like the German her. Hair, 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 hair. God, this has become how to pronounce anything stream. One sip of coffee, please. Sorry. Face, you fit in perfectly with the knitted blanket thing, knitted scarf thing. Your color, perfection. Mwah. Okay, hang on. Her Ribbentrop. On that first night, Lord Halifax had arrived in a mood of great weariness. Virtually, his first words on being shown in were, "Really, Darlington, I don't know what you have put me up to here. I know I shall be sorry." Herr Ribbentrop not being expected for a further hour or so, his lordship had suggested to his guest a tour of Darlington Hall, a strategy which had helped many nervous visitors to relax. However, as I went about on my business, all I could hear for some time was Lord Halifax in various parts of the building continuing to express his doubts about the evening ahead, and Lord Darlington trying in vain to reassure him. But then at one point I overheard Lord Halifax exclaiming, "My goodness, Lord Darlington!" Wait. Yeah, it's a cutie frog. It's the cutest one I've seen so far. Truly is. I'm not kidding, seriously. Lord Darlington. At one point, I overheard Lord Halifax exclaiming, "My goodness, Darlington, the silver in this house is a delight." I was, of course, very pleased to hear this at the time, but what was for me truly satisfactory corollary to this episode came 2 or 3 days later when Lord Darlington remarked to me, "By the way, Stevens, Lord Halifax was jolly impressed with the silver the other night. Put him into a different frame of mind altogether." These were, I recollected clearly, his lordship's actual words, and so it is not simply my fantasy that state of the silver had made a small but significant contribution towards the easing of relations between Lord Halifax and her Ribbentrop that evening. It is probably apt at this point to say a few words concerning Herr Ribbentrop. It is, of course, generally accepted today that Herr Ribbentrop was a trickster, that it was Hitler's plan throughout those years to deceive England for as long as possible concerning his true intention, and that Herr Ribbentrop's sole mission in our country was to orchestrate this deception. As I say, this is the commonly held view, and I do not wish to differ with it here. It is, however, rather irksome to have hear some people talking today as though they were never for a moment taken in by Herr Ribbentrop, as though Lord Darlington was alone in believing Herr Ribbentrop an honourable gentleman and developing a working relationship with him. The truth is that Herr Ribbentrop was throughout the 30s a well-regarded figure, even a glamorous one in the very best of houses. Particularly around 1936 and 1937, I can recall all the talk in the servants' hall from the visiting staff revolving around the German ambassador. And it was clear from what was said that many of the most distinguished ladies and gentlemen in this country were quite enamored of him. It is, as I say, irksome to have heard the way these people now talk about those times, and in particular what some have said concerning his lordship. The great hypocrisy of these persons could be instantly obvious to you. Were you to see just a few of their own guest lists from those days, you would see then not only the extent to which Herr Ribbentrop dined at these same persons' tables, but he often did so as a guest of honor. And then again, you will hear the same persons talking as though Lord Darlington did something unusual in receiving hospitalities from the Nazis on the several trips he made to Germany during those years. I do not suppose they would speak quite so readily if, say, the Times were to publish even one of these guest lists to the banquet given by the Germans around the time of the Nuremberg rally. The fact is, the most established, respected ladies and gentlemen in England were availing themselves in the hospitality of the German leaders, and I can vouch at first hand that the great majority of these persons were returning with nothing but praise and admiration for their host. Anyone who implies that Lord Darlington was liaising covertly with a known enemy is just conveniently forgetting the true climate of those times. It needs to be said, too, what salacious nonsense it is to claim that Lord Darlington was anti-Semitic, or that he had close association with organizations like the British Union of Fascists, the Fascists. Such claims can only arise from complete ignorance of those sort of gentlemen his lordship was. Lord Darlington came to abhor anti-Semitism. I heard him express his disgust on several separate occasions, and when confronted with anti-Semitic sentiments, and the allegations that his lordship never allowed Jewish people to enter the house or any Jewish staff to be employed is utterly unfounded, especially perhaps in respect to one very minor episode in the 30s which had been blown up out of all proportion. And as for the British Union of Fascists, I can only say that any talk linking his lordship to such people is quite ridiculous. Sir Oswald Mosley, the gentleman who led the Black Shirts, was a visitor of Darlington Hall on, I would say, 3 occasions at the most, and these visits all took place during the early days of the organization before it had betrayed its true nature. Once the ugliness of the Black Shirts movement became apparent, and let it be said his lordship was quicker than most in noticing it, Lord Darlington had no further associations with such people. In any case, such organizations were a complete irrelevance to the heart of the political life in this country. Lord Darlington, you will understand, was the sort of gentleman who cared to occupy himself not with what was at the true nature of things, and the figures he gathered together in his efforts over those years were as far away from such unpleasant fringe groups as one could imagine. Not only were they eminently respectable, these were figures who held real influence in British life: politicians, diplomats, military men, clergy. Indeed, some of these personages were Jewish, and this fact alone should demonstrate how nonsensical is much of what was said about his lordship. But I drift. I was, in fact, discussing the silver and how Lord Halifax had been suitably impressed on the evening of his meeting with Herr Ribbentrop at the Darlington Hall. Let me make it clear. I was not for a moment suggesting that what had initially threatened to be a disappointing evening for my employer had turned into a triumphant one solely on account of the silver. But then, As I indicated, Lord Darlington himself suggested that the silver might have been at least a small factor in the change of the guest's mood that evening, and it is perhaps not absurd to think back to such instances with a glow of satisfaction. There are certain members of our profession who would have it that it ultimately makes little difference what sort of employer one serves, who believe that the sort of idealism prevalent amongst our generation, namely the notion that we butlers should aspire to serve those great gentlemen who further the cause of humanity, is just high-flown talk with no grounding in reality. It is, of course, noticeable that the individuals who express such skepticism invariably turn out to be the most mediocre in our profession. Those who know they lack the ability to progress into any position of note and who aspire only to drag as many down to their own level as possible, and one is hardly tempted to take such opinions seriously. But for all that, it is still satisfying to be able to point to instances in one career that highlight was clearly how wrong such people are. Of course, one seeks to provide a general, sustained service to one employer, and the value of which could never be reduced to a number of specific instances, such as that one concerning Lord Halifax. But what I am saying is that it is this sort of instances which, over time, come to symbolize an irrefutable fact, namely that one has had the privilege of practicing one's profession at the fulcrum of great affairs, and one has right perhaps to feel a satisfaction those content to serve mediocre employers will never know, the satisfaction of being able to say with some reason that one's effort in however modest a way comprised a contribution to the course of society. But perhaps one should not be looking back to the past so much. After all, I still have before me many more years of service I am required to give. And not only is Mr. Faraday a most excellent employer, he is an American gentleman to whom surely one has a special duty to show all that is best about service in England. It is essential, then, to keep one's attention focused on the present, to guard against any complacency creeping in account of what one may have achieved in the past. For it has to be admitted, over the last few months, things have not been all they might at Darlington Hall. A small number of errors have surfaced of late, including that incident last April relating to the silver. Most fortunately, it was not an occasion on which Mr. Faraday had guessed, but even so, it was a moment of genuine embarrassment to me. It had occurred at breakfast one morning, and for his part, Mr. Faraday, either through kindness or because being an American, he failed to recognize the extent of the shortcoming, did not utter one word of complaint to me throughout the whole episode. He had, upon seating himself, simply picked up the fork, examined it briefly, touching the prongs with his tips, then turned his attention to the morning headlines. The whole gesture had been carried out in an absent-minded sort of way, but of course I had spotted the occurrence and had advanced swiftly to remove the offending item. I may in fact have done so too swiftly on account of my disturbance, for Mr. Faraday gave a small start, muttering, "Ah, Stevens." I had continued to proceed swiftly out of the room, returning without undue delay, bearing a satisfactory fog. As I advanced upon the table, and Mr. Faraday now apparently absorbed in his newspaper, it occurred to me I might slip the fork on the tablecloth quietly without disturbing my employer's reading. However, the possibility had already occurred to me that Mr. Faraday was simply feigning indifference in order to minimize my embarrassment, and such a surreptitious delivery could not be interpreted as complacency on my part towards my error, or worse, an attempt to cover it up. This is why then I decided, if appropriate, I decided it appropriate to put the fork down on the table with certain emphasis, causing my employer a start a second time, look up and mutter again, "Ah, Stevens." Errors such as these, which have occurred over the last few months, have been naturally, though, injurious to one's self-respect. But then, there's no reason to believe them to be the signs of anything more sinister than a staff shortage. Not that a staff shortage is not significant in itself, but if Miss Kenton were indeed to return to Darlington Hall, such little slips, I am sure, would become a thing of the past. Of course, one has to remember there is nothing stated specifically in Miss Kenton's letter, which incidentally I reread last night up in my room before putting out the light, to indicate unambiguously her desire to return to her former position. In fact, one has to accept the distinct possibility that one may have previously, perhaps through wishful thinking of a professional kind, exaggerated what evidence there was regarding such a desire on her part. For I must say, I was a little surprised last night at how difficult it was actually to point to any passage which clearly demonstrated her wish to return. But then again, it seems hardly worthwhile to speculate greatly on the matters now, when one knows one will, in all likelihood, be talking face to face with Miss Kenton within 48 hours. Still, I must say, I did spend some long minutes turning those passages over in my mind last night as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of from below, the Lord and his wife clearing up for the night. We are continuing. Day 3, evening, Moscombe, near Tavistock, Devon. One sip of coffee. We are continuing The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Day 3, evening, Moscombe, near Tavistock, Devon. I feel I should perhaps return a moment to the question of his lordship's attitude towards Jewish persons, since this whole issue of anti-Semitism, I realize, has become a rather sensitive one these days. In particular, let me clear up this matter of a supposed bar against Jewish persons on the staff at Darlington Hall. Since these allegations falls very directly into my own realm, I am able to refute it with absolute authority. There were many Jewish persons on my staff throughout all my years with his lordship, and let me say furthermore that they were never treated in any way differently on account of their race. One really cannot guess the reason for these absurd allegations, unless quite ludicrously they originate from that brief, entirely significant few weeks in the early 30s when Mrs. Caroline Barnett came to wield an unusual influence over his lordship. Mrs. Barnett, the widow of Mr. Charles Barnett, was at that moment in her 40s, a very handsome, some might say a glamorous lady. She had a reputation for being formidably intelligent, and in those days one often tended to hear of how she had humiliated this or that learned gentleman at dinner over some important contemporary issue. For much of the summer of 1932, she was a regular presence at Darlington Hall, and she and his lordship often spending hour after hour in deep conversation, typically in social or political nature. It was Mrs. Barnett, as I recall, who took his lordship on those guided inspections of the poorest areas of London East End, during which his lordship visited actual homes of many families suffering the desperate plight of those years. That is to say, Mrs. Barnett, in all likelihood, made some sort of contribution to Lord Darlington's developing concern to the poor of our country, and such as her influence cannot be said to have been entirely negative. But she was too, of course, a member of Sir Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts organization, and the very little contact his lordship ever had with Sir Oswald occurred during those weeks of that summer, and it was during those same weeks that those entirely untypical incidents took place at Darlington Hall, which must, one suppose, have provided what flimsy basis exists for these absurd allegations. I call them incidents because some of these were extremely minor. For instance, I recall overhearing at a dinner one evening, when a particular newspaper had been mentioned, his lordship remarking, "Oh, you mean the Jewish propaganda sheet?" And then, on another occasion, around that time, I remember his instructing me to cease giving donation to a particular local charity which regularly come to our door on the grounds that the management committee was more or less homogeneously Jewish. I have remembered these remarks because they truly surprised me at the time. His lordship never previously shown any antagonism whatsoever towards the Jewish race. Then, of course, came that afternoon. His lordship called me into his study. Initially, he made a rather general conversation, inquiring if all was well around the house and so on. Then he said, "I've been doing a great deal of thinking, Stevens. A great deal of thinking. And I have reached my conclusion. We cannot have Jews on the staff here at the Darlington Hall." "Sir? It is good for the house, Stevens. In the interest of the guests we have staying here, I've looked into this carefully, Stevens, and I'm letting you know my conclusion." "Very well, sir. Tell me, Stevens, we have a few on the staff at the moment, don't we? Jews, I mean." "I believe 2 of the present staff would fall into the category, sir." "Ah." His lordship paused for a moment, and staring out of his window, "Of course, you have to let them go." "I beg your pardon, sir?" "It is regrettable, Stevens, but we have no choice. There is the safety and well-being of my guests to consider. Let me assure you, I have looked into this matter and thought it through thoroughly. It is all in our best interest." The 2 staff members concerned were in fact both housemates. It would hardly have been proper then to have taken any action without first informing Miss Kenton of the situation, and I resolved to do just this the same evening when I met her for cocoa in her parlour. I should perhaps say a few words here concerning these meetings in her parlour at the end of each day. These were, let me say, overwhelmingly professional in tone, though naturally we might discuss some informal topics from time to time. Our reason for instituting such meetings was simple. We had found our respective lives were often so busy, several days could go without our having an opportunity to exchange even the most basic of information. Such a situation, we recognized, seriously jeopardize the smooth running of operations, and to spend 15 minutes or so together at the end of the day in the privacy of Miss Kenton's parlour was the most straightforward remedy. I must reiterate, these meetings were predominantly professional in character, that is to say, for instance, we might talk over the plans of a forthcoming event, or else discuss how a new recruit was settling in. In any case, to return to my thread, you will appreciate I was not unperturbed at the prospect of telling Miss Kenton I was about to dismiss 2 of her maids. Indeed, the maids had been perfectly satisfactory employees, and I may as well say this, since the Jewish issue has become so sensitive of late, my every instinct opposed the idea of their dismissal. However, my duty in this instance was quite clear, and as I saw it, there was nothing to be gained at all in irresponsibly in irresponsibly displaying such personal doubts. It was a difficult task, but as such one that demanded to be carried out with dignity. And so it was that when I finally raised the matter towards the end of our conversation that evening, I did so as concise and businesslike a way as possible, concluding with words, "I will speak to the 2 employees in the pantry tomorrow morning at 10:30. I will be grateful then, Miss Kenton, if you would send them along. I leave it entirely to yourself whether or not you inform them beforehand as to the nature of what I am going to say to them." At this point, Miss Kenton seemed to have nothing to say in response, so I continued. Well, Miss Kenton, thank you for the cocoa. It's high time I was turning in. Another busy day tomorrow. It was then Miss Kenton said, Mr. Stevens, I cannot quite believe my ears. Ruth and Sarah have been members of our staff for over 6 years now. I trust them absolutely, and indeed they trust me. They have served this house excellently. I'm sure that is so, Miss Kenton. However, we must not allow sentiment to creep in our judgment. Now really, I must bid you good night. Mr. Stevens, I'm outraged that you can sit there and utter what you have just done as though you were discussing orders for the larder. I simply cannot believe it. You're saying you're saying Ruth and Sarah are to be dismissed on the ground that they are Jewish? Miss Kenton, I have just this moment explained the situation to you fully. His Lordship has made his decision, and there is nothing for you and I to debate over. Does it not occur to you, Mrs. Stevens, that to dismiss Ruth and Sarah on these grounds would simply be wrong? I would not stand for such things. I would not work in a house in which such things can occur. Miss Kenton, I will ask you not to excite yourself and to conduct yourself in a manner befitting your position. This, if his Lordship wishes these particular contracts to be discontinued, then there's little more to be said. I'm warning you, Mrs. Stevens, I will not continue to work in such a house. If my girls are dismissed, I will leave also. Miss Kenton, I'm surprised to find you reacting in this manner. Surely I don't have to remind you that our professional duty is not to our own foibles and sentiments, but to the wishes of our employer. I'm telling you, Mr. Stevens, if you dismiss my girls tomorrow, it will be wrong, a sin as any sin ever was one, and I will not continue to work in such a house. Miss Kenton, let me suggest to you that you are hardly well placed to be passing judgment of such a high and mighty nature. The fact is, the world of today is a very complicated and treacherous place. There are many things you and I are not simply in position to understand concerning, say, the nature of Jewry, whereas his lordship, I might venture, is somewhat better placed to judge for what is for the best. Now, Miss Kenton, I really must retire. I thank you again for the cocoa. 10:30 tomorrow morning. Send the 2 employees concerned, please. It was evident from the moment the 2 maids stepped into the pantry the following morning that Miss Kenton had already spoken to them, for they both came in sobbing. I explained the situation to them as briefly as possible, underlining that their work has been satisfactory and that they would accordingly receive good references. As I recall, neither of them said anything of note throughout the whole interview, which lasted perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, and they left sobbing just as they had arrived. Miss Kenton was extremely cold towards me for some days following the dismissal of the employees. Indeed, at times she was quite rude to me, even in the presence of the staff. And although we continued our habit of meeting for cocoa in the evening, the sessions tended to be brief and unfriendly. When there had been no signs of her behavior abating after a fortnight or so, I think you will understand that I started to become a little impatient. I thus said to her during one of our cocoa sessions in an ironic tone of voice, Miss Kenton, I would rather expected you to have handed in your notice by now, accompanying this with a light laugh, and make some conciliatory response or other, allowing us once and for all to put the whole episode behind us. Miss Kenton, however, simply looked at me sternly and said, I still have every intention of handing in my notice, Mr. Stevens. It is merely that I have been so busy I have not had time to see to the matter. This did, I must admit, make me a little concerned for a time that she was serious about her threat. But then, a week followed week, it became clear that there was no question of her leaving Darlington Hall, and the atmosphere between us gradually thawed. I suppose I tended to tease her every now and then by reminding of her threatened resignation. For instance, if we are discussing some future large occasion to be held at the house, I might put in, "That is, Miss Kenton, assuming that you are still with us at that stage." Even months after the event, such remarks still tended to make Miss Kenton go quiet. Though, at this stage, I fancy this was due to more to embarrassment than anger. Eventually, of course, the matter came to be by and large forgotten. I remember it coming up one last time over a year after the dismissal of the two maids. It was his lordship who initially revived the matter one afternoon when I was serving his tea in the drawing room. By then, Mrs. Caroline Barnett's days of influence over his lordship were well over indeed. The lady had ceased to be a visitor at Darlington Hall altogether. It was worth pointing out furthermore that his lordship had by that time severed all links with the Blackshirts, having witnessed the true ugly nature of the organization. "Oh, Stevens," he said to me, "I've been meaning to say to you about that business last year, about the Jewish maids. Do you recall the matter?" "Indeed, sir." "I suppose there's no way tracing them now, is there? It was wrong about what happened, and one would like to recompense them somehow." I will certainly look into the matter, sir, but I am not at all certain it will be possible to ascertain their whereabouts at this stage. See what you can do. It was wrong what occurred." I assumed this exchange with his lordship would be some interest to Miss Kenton, and I decided it only proper to mention it to her, even at the risk of her getting angry again. As it turns out, my doing so on that foggy afternoon I encountered her in the summer house produced curious results. I recall a mist starting to set in as I crossed the lawn that afternoon. I was making my way up to the summer house for the purpose of clearing away the remains of his lordship's tea. There was some guests a little while earlier. I can recall spotting from some distance long before reaching the steps where my father had once fallen, Miss Kenton's figure moving about inside the summer house. When I entered, she had seated herself in one of the wicker chairs scattered around its interior, evidently engaged in some needlework. On closer inspection, I saw she was performing repairs to a cushion. I went about gathering up the various items of crockery from amidst the plants and cane furniture, and as I did so, I believe we exchanged a few pleasantries, perhaps discussed one or two professional matters, for the truth was, it was extremely refreshing to be out in the summer house after many continuous days in the main building, and neither of us was inclined to hurry with our task. Indeed, though one could not see out that far that day, on account of the encroaching mist, and the daylight too was rapidly fading at this stage, obliging Miss Kenton to hold her needlework up to the last of it. I remember our often breaking off from our respective activities simply to gaze out at the view around us. In fact, I was looking out over the lawn to where the mist was thickening down around the poplar trees planted along the cart track, when I finally introduced the topic of the previous year's dismissals. Perhaps, a little predictably, I did so by saying, "I was just thinking earlier, Miss Kenton. It's rather funny to remember now, but you know, only this time a year ago you were still insisting you were going to resign. It rather amused me to think of it." I gave a laugh, but behind me, Miss Kenton remained silent. When I finally turned to look at her, she was gazing through the glass at the great expanse of fog outside. "You have no idea, Mr. Stevens," she said eventually, "how seriously I really thought of leaving this house. I felt so strongly about what would happen. Had I been anyone worthy of any respect at all, I dare say I would have left at Darlington Hall long ago." She paused for a while, and I turned my gaze back out to the poplar trees down in the distance. Then she continued in a tired voice, "It was cowardice, Mr. Stevens, simple cowardice. Where could I have gone? I have no family, only my aunt. I love her dearly, but I can't live with her for a day without feeling my whole life is wasting away. I did tell myself, of course, I would soon find myself in some new situation, But I was so frightened, Mr. Stevens. Whenever I thought of leaving, I just saw myself going out there and finding nobody who knew or cared about me. There, that's all my high principles amount to. I feel so ashamed of myself. But I just couldn't leave, Mr. Stevens. I just couldn't bring myself to leave. Miss Kenton paused again and seemed to be in deep thought. I thus thought it would be I thus thought it opportune to relate at this point as precisely as possible what had taken place earlier between myself and Lord Darlington. I proceeded to do so and concluded by saying, "What's done can hardly be undone, but it is at least a great comfort to hear his lordship declare unequivocally that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I just thought you would like to know, Miss Kenton, since I recall you were as distressed by the episode as I was." "I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens," Miss Kenton said behind me, in an entirely new voice, as though she had just been jolted from her dream. "I don't understand you." Then as I turned to her, she went on, "As I recall, you thought it was only right and proper that Ruth and Sarah be sent packing. You were positively cheerful about it. Now really, Miss Kenton, it's quite incorrect and unfair. The whole matter caused me great concern indeed. It is hardly the sort of thing I like to see happen in this house." "Then why, Mr. Stevens, did you not tell me so at that moment?" I gave a laugh, but for a moment was rather at a loss for an answer. Before I could formulate one, Miss Kenton put down her sewing and said, "Do you realize, Mr. Stevens, how much it would have meant to me if you had thought to share your feelings last year? You knew how upset I was when my girls were dismissed. Do you realize how much it would have helped me? Why, Mr. Stevens, why do you always have to pretend?" I gave another laugh at the ridiculous turn the conversation had suddenly taken. "Really, Miss Kenton," I said, "I'm not sure what you mean. Pretend? Why, really, I suffered so much over Ruth and Sarah leaving us, and I suffered all the more because I believed I was alone. Really, Miss Kenton." I picked the tray on which I had gathered together the used crockery. Naturally, one disapproved of the dismissals. One would have thought that quite self-evident. She did not say anything, and as I was leaving, I glanced back towards her. She was again gazing out at the view, but it had at this point grown so dark inside the summer house, all I could see of her was a profile outlined by a pale and empty background. I excused myself and proceeded to make my exit. Now that I have recalled this episode of dismissing of the Jewish employees, I am reminded of what could, I suppose, be called a curious corollary to the whole affair, namely the arrival of the housemaid Lisa. That is to say, we were obliged to find a replacement for the two dismissed Jewish maids, and this Lisa turned out to be one of them. This young woman had applied for the vacancy with the most dubious of reference, which spelled out to any experienced butler that she had left her previous situation under something of a cloud. Moreover, when Miss Kenton and I questioned her, it became clear that she had never remained in any position longer than a few weeks. In general, her whole attitude suggested to me that she was quite unsuitable for the employment at Darlington Hall. To my surprise, however, once we had finished interviewing the girl, Miss Kenton began to insist we take her on. "I see so much potential in this girl," she continued to say. In the face of my protest, "She will be directly under my supervision, and I will see to it that she proves good." I recall we became locked in disagreement for some time, and it was perhaps only the fact that the matter of the dismissed maids was so recent in our minds that I did not hold out so strongly as I might against Miss Kenton. In any case, the result was that I finally gave way, albeit by saying, "Miss Kenton, I hope you realize that the responsibility for taking on this girl rests squarely with yourself. There is no doubt, as far as I am concerned, that at this present moment she is far from the adequate far from adequate to be a member of our staff. I'm only allowing her to join on the understanding that you will personally oversee her development. The girl will turn out well, Mr. Stevens, you see. And to my astonishment, during the weeks that followed, the young girl did indeed make progress at a remarkable rate. Her attitude seemed to improve by the day, and even her manner of walking and going about tasks, which during her first days had been so slovenly that one had to avert one's eye, improved dramatically. As the weeks went on, the girl appeared miraculously to have transformed into a useful member of the staff. Miss Kenton's triumph was obvious. She seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning Lisa some task or other that required a little extra responsibility. And if I were watching, she would be sure to try to catch my eye with her rather mocking expression. And the exchange we had that night in Miss Kenton's parlor over cocoa was fairly typical of the sort of conversation we tended to have on topic of Lisa. No doubt, Mr. Stevens, she said to me, you will be extremely disappointed to hear that Lisa has still not made any real mistakes worth speaking of. I'm not disappointed at all, Miss Kenton. I'm very pleased for you and for all of us. I will admit, you have had some modest success regarding the girls thus far. Modest success? And look at the smile on your face, Mr. Stevens. It always appears when I mention Lisa. That tells an interesting story in itself. A very interesting story indeed. Oh, really, Miss Kenton? And may I ask what exactly? It is very interesting, Mr. Stevens. Very interesting you should have been so pessimistic about her, because Lisa is a very pretty girl, no doubt about it, and I notice you have a curious aversion to pretty girls being on the staff. You know perfectly well that you are talking nonsense, Miss Kenton. Ah, but I've noticed it, Mr. Stevens. You do not like pretty girls to be on the staff. Might it be that our Mr. Stevens fear distraction? Can it be that our Mr. Stevens is flesh and blood after all and cannot fully trust himself? Really, Miss Kenton, if I thought there was one modicum of sense in what you are saying, I might bother to engage with you in this evening. As it is, I think I shall simply place my thoughts elsewhere while you chatter away. Ah, but then, why is that guilty smile still on your face, Mr. Stevens? It is not a guilty smile at all, Miss Kenton. I'm slightly amused by your astonishing capacity to talk nonsense after all. It is a guilty smile you have on, Mr. Stevens, and I have noticed how you can hardly bear to look at Lisa. And now it is beginning to become very clear why you objected so strongly to her. My objection was extremely solid, Miss Kenton. As you very well know, the girl was completely unsuitable when she first came to us. Now, of course, you must understand we would never have carried on in such a vein within the hearing of the staff members. But just around the time our cocoa evenings, while maintaining their essentially professional character, often tended to allow room for a little harmless talk of this sort, which did much, one should say, to relieve the many tensions produced by a hard day. Lisa had been with us for some 8 or 9 months, and I had largely forgotten her existence by this point, when she vanished from the house together with the second footman. Now, of course, such things are simply part and parcel of life for any butler of a large household. They are intensely irritating, but one learns to accept them. In fact, as far as this sort of moonlight departures were concerned, this was among the more civilized. Aside from a little food, the couple had taken nothing that belonged to the house. And furthermore, both parties had left letters. The second footman, whose name I no longer recall, left a short note addressed to me saying something like, "Please do not judge us too harshly. We are in love and we are going to be married." And Lisa had written a much longer note addressed to the housekeeper. And it was this letter Miss Kenton brought into my pantry on the morning following their disappearance. There were, as I recall, many misspelled, ill-formed sentences about how much in love the couple were, how wonderful the second footman was, and how marvelous the future that that awaited them both. One line, as I recall it, reads something to the effect of, "We don't have money, but who cares? We have love, and who wants anything else? We've got one another, that's all anyone ever want." Despite the letter being 3 pages long, there was no mention of gratitude towards Miss Kenton for the great care she had given the girl, nor was there any note of regret at letting all of us down. Miss Kenton was noticeably upset. All the while I was running my eye over the young woman's letter, she sat there at the table before me, looking down at her hands. In fact, and this struck one as rather curious, I cannot really recall seeing her more bereft than on that morning. When I put the letter down on the table, she said, "So, Mr. Stevens, it seems that you are right and I was wrong. Miss Kenton, this is nothing to be upset yourself over," I said. "These things happen. There really is little the likes of us can ever do to prevent these things. I was at fault, Mr. Stevens. I accept it. You were right all along as ever and I was wrong. Miss Kenton, I cannot really agree with you. You did wonders with that girl. What you managed with her proved many times over that it was in fact I was in the error. Really, Miss Kenton, what has happened now might have happened with any other employee. You did remarkably well with her. You may very well have every reason to be let down by her, but no reason at all to feel responsibility on your own part." Miss Kenton continued to look very dejected. She said quietly, "You're very kind to say so, Mr. Stevens. I'm very grateful." Then she sighed tiredly and said, "She's so foolish. She might have had a real career in front of her. She had ability. So many young women like her throw away their chances, and all for what?" We both looked at the notepaper on the table between us, and then Miss Kenton turned her gaze away with an air of annoyance. "Indeed," I said, "such a waste, as you say. So foolish. And the girl is bound to be let down. And she had a good life ahead of her if only she persevered. In a year or two, I could have her ready to take on housekeeper's post in some small residence. Perhaps you could think that far-fetched, Mrs. Stevens, but then look at how far I came with her in a few months, and now she's thrown it all away. All for nothing. It really is most foolish of her." As I started to gather up the sheets of notepaper before me, thinking I might file them away for reference, but then, as I was doing so, I became a little uncertain as to whether Miss Kenton had intended me to keep the letter, or if she herself wished to do so, and I placed the pages back down on the table between the two of us. Miss Kenton, in any case, seemed far away. "She's bound to be let down," she said again. "So foolish. But I see I have become somewhat lost in these old memories. This had never been my intention, but then it is probably no bad thing if in doing so I have at least avoided becoming unduly preoccupied in the events of this evening, which I trust have now finally concluded themselves. For these last few hours, it must say, have been rather trying ones. I find myself now in the attic of this small cottage belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. It is to say, this is a very private residence. This room, made so kindly available to me tonight by the Taylors, was once occupied by their eldest son, now long grown and living in Exeter. It is a room dominated by heavy beams and rafters, and the floorboards have no carpet or rug to cover them, and yet the atmosphere was surprisingly cozy. And it is clear Mrs. Taylor had not only made up the bed for me, she had also tidied and cleaned, for aside for a few cobwebs near the rafters, there is little to reveal that this room had been unoccupied for many years. As for Mr. and Mrs. Taylor themselves, I have ascertained that they ran the village greengrocery here from the 20s until their retirement 3 years ago. They are kind people, and though I have on more than one occasion tonight offered remuneration for their hospitality, they will not hear it. The fact that I am here now, the fact that I have came to be all intents and purposes at the mercy of Mr. and Mrs. Taylor's generosity on this night is attributed to one foolish, infuriating, simple oversight, namely, I allowed the fort to run out of petrol. With what with what with this and the trouble yesterday concerning the lack of water in the radiator, it would not be unreasonable for an observer to believe such general disorganization endemic to my nature. It may be pointed out, of course, that as far as the long-distance motoring is concerned, I am something of a novice, and some simple oversight are only to be expected. And yet, when one remembers that good organization and foresight are qualities that lie in the very heart of one's profession, it is hard to avoid the feeling that one has somehow let oneself down again. But it is true. I had been considerably distracted during the last hour or so of motoring prior to the petrol running out. I had planned to lodge the night in the town of Tavistock, where I arrived a little before 8 o'clock. At the town's main inn, however, I was informed that all the rooms were occupied on account of a local agricultural fair. Several other establishments were suggested to me, but though I called each of them, I was met every time with the same apology. Finally, at a boarding house on the edge of the town, the landlady suggested that I motor several miles to a roadside inn run by a relative of hers, which, she assures me, was bound to have vacancies, being too far out of Tavistock to be affected by the fair. She had given me thorough directions, which had seemed clear enough at the time, and it is impossible to say now whose fault it was that I subsequently failed to find any trace of this roadside establishment. Instead, after 15 minutes or so of motoring, I found myself out on the long road curving across bleak open moorland. Oh, on either side of me were what appeared to be fields of marsh and the mist of rolling across my path. To my left, I could see the last glow of sunset. The skyline was broken here and there by the shapes of barns and farmhouses some way away over the fields, but otherwise I appeared to have left behind all signs of community. I recall turning the ford around at this stage and doubling back on some distance in search of a turning I had passed earlier, but when I found it, this new road proved, if anything, more desolate than the one I had left. For a time, if anything, more desolate than... For a time, I drove in near darkness between two hedges, then found the road beginning to climb steeply. I had by now given up hope of finding the roadside inn, and had set my mind on motoring on till I reached the next town or village, seeking shelter there. It would be easy enough, so I was reasoning to myself, to resume my planned route first in the morning. It was this point, halfway up the hill, that the engine started, and I noticed for the first time that my petrol was gone. The fort continued its climb for several more yards, then came to a halt. When I got out to assess my situation, I could see I had only a few more minutes of daylight left to me. I was standing on a steep road bound in by trees and hedgerows much further up the hill. I could see a break in the hedges where a wide barren gate stood outlined against the sky. I began to make my way up to it, supposing that a view from this gate would give me some sense of my bearings. Perhaps I had even hoped to see a farmhouse nearby where I could gain prompt assistance. I was a little disconcerted by what eventually greeted my eyes. On the other side of the gate, a field sloped down very steeply, so that it fell out of vision only 20 yards or so in front of me. Beyond the crest of the field, some way off in the distance, perhaps a good mile or so, as the crow would fly, was a small village. I could make out through the mist church steeple and around about it. Clusters of dark slated roof. Here and there, wisps of white smoke were rising from the chimneys. One has to confess, at that moment, to being overcome by a certain sense of discouragement. Of course, the situation was not by any means hopeless. The fort was not damaged, simply out of fuel. A walk down to the village could be accomplished in a half an hour or so. There, I could surely find accommodation and a can of petrol. And yet, it was not a happy feeling to be up there on a lonely hill looking over a gate at the lights coming on in the distant village. The daylight all but faded and the mist growing ever thicker. There was little there was little to be gained in growing despondent. However, in any case, it would have been foolish to waste the few remaining minutes of daylight. I walked back down to the fort where I packed a briefcase of what with some essential items. Then, arming myself with a bicycle lamp, which cast a surprisingly good beam, I went in search of a path by which I could descend to the village. But no such path offered itself, though. I went some distance up the hill and a good way past my gate. Then I sensed that the road had ceased to climb, but beginning to curve down slowly in a direction away from the village. The lights of which I could glimpse regularly through the foliage, I was overcome again by a sense of discouragement. In fact, for a moment I wondered if my best strategy would not be to retrace my steps to the fort and simply to sit in it until another motorist came by. By then, however, it was very close to being dark, and I could see that if one were to attempt to hail a passing vehicle in these circumstances, one might easily be taken for a highwayman or some such. Besides, not a single vehicle had passed since I had gotten out of the fort. In fact, I could not remember having seen another vehicle at all since leaving Tavistock. I resolved then to return as far as to the gate and from there descend the field, walking in as direct a line as possible towards the light of the village, regarding on whether or not there was a proper path. It was not, in the end, too arduous in descent. A series of grazing fields, one after the next, led to way down to the village, and by keeping close to the edge of each field as one descended, one could be assured of reasonable walking. Only once, with the village very close, could I find no obvious way to gain access to the next field down. I had to shine my bicycle lamp to and fro along the hedgerows obstructing me. Eventually, found a small gap through which I proceeded to squeeze my person, but only at some cost to the shoulder of my jacket and turn up of my trousers. The last few fields, furthermore, became increasingly muddy, and I deliberately refrained from shining my lamp to my shoes and turn-ups for the fear of further discouragement. By and by, I found myself on a paved path going down into the village, and it was while descending this path that I met Mr. Taylor, my kind host of this evening. He emerged out of a turning a few yards in front of me and had courteously waited for me to catch up, whereupon he had touched his cap and asked me if he could be of any assistance to me. I had explained my position as succinctly as possible, adding that I would be most gratified to be guided towards a good inn. At this, Mr. Taylor had shaken his head, saying, "I'm afraid there's no inn as such in our village, sir. John Humphreys usually takes in travellers at the Cross Keys, but he's having work done to the roof at the moment." Before this distressing piece of information could have its full effect, however, Mr. Taylor said, "If you don't mind roughing a little, sir, we could offer you a room and a bed for the night. It's nothing special, but the wife will see to it everything's clean and comfortable enough in a basic sort of way." I believe I uttered some words, perhaps in a rather half-hearted way, to the effect that I could not inconvenience them to such an extent, to which Mr. Taylor had said, "I tell you, sir, it would be an honour to have you. It's not often we get the likes of yourself passing through Moscombe. And quite honestly, sir, I don't know what else you could do at this hour. The wife would never forgive me if I were to let you away into the night." Thus, it was that I came to accept the kind hospitality of Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. But when I spoke earlier of this evening's events of being trying, I wasn't referring simply to the frustrations of running out of petrol and of having to make such an uncouth journey down into the village. For what occurred subsequently, what unfolded once I sat down to supper with Mr. and Mrs. Taylor and their neighbors, proved in its own way far more taxing on one's resources than the essentially physical discomfort that I had faced earlier. It was, I can assure you, a relief indeed to be able to at last to come up to this room and to spend some moments turning over these memories of Darlington Hall from all those years ago. That the fact is, I have tended increasingly of late to indulge myself in such recollection, and ever since the prospect of seeing Miss Kenton again first arose some weeks ago, I suppose I have tended to spend much time pondering just why it was our relationship underwent such a change. For for change, it certainly did. Sorry. For change, it certainly did around 1935 or 1936, after many years in which we had steadily achieved a fine professional understanding. In fact, by the end, we had even abandoned our routine of meeting over a cup of cocoa at the end of each day. But as to what really caused such changes, just what particular chain of events was really responsible, I have never quite been able to decide. In thinking about this recently, it seems possible that that odd incident the evening Miss Kenton came into my pantry uninvited may have marked a crucial turning point. Why it was she came to my pantry I cannot remember with certainty. I have a feeling she may have come bearing a vase of flowers to brighten things up. But then again, I may be confused with the time she attempted the same thing years earlier at the start of our acquaintanceship. I know for a fact she tried to introduce flowers to my pantry on at least 3 occasions over the years, but perhaps I am confusing in believing this too have been what brought her that particular evening. I might emphasize in any case, notwithstanding our years of good working relationship, I had never allowed the situation to slip to one in which the housekeeper was coming and going from my pantry all day. The butler's pantry, as far as I am concerned, is a crucial office, the heart of the house operation, not unlike a general's headquarters during a battle. And it's imperative that all things in it are ordered and left ordered in precisely the way I wish them to be. I have never been the sort of butler who allows all sort of people to wander in and out with their queries and grumbles. If operations were to be conducted in a smoothly coordinated way, it is surely obvious that the butler's pantry must be the one place in the house where privacy and solitude are guaranteed. As it happened, when she entered my pantry that evening, it was not in fact engaged in professional matters. That is to say, it was towards the end of the day during a quiet week, and I had been enjoying a rare hour or so of duty. As I say, I am not certain if Miss Kenton entered with her vase of flowers, but I certainly do recall her saying, "Mrs. Stevens, your room looks even less accommodating at night than it does in the day. The electric light is too dim, surely, for you to be reading by." "It is perfectly adequate, thank you, Miss Kenton." "Really, Mr. Stevens, this room resembles a prison cell. All one needs is a small bed in the corner, and one could well imagine condemned men spending their last hours here." Perhaps I said something to this, and I do not know. In any case, I did not look up from my reading, and a few moments passed during which I waited for Miss Kenton to excuse herself and leave, but then I heard her saying, "Now I wonder what it could be you are reading there, Mrs. Stevens." "Simply a book, Miss Kenton." I looked up to see Miss Kenton advancing towards me. I shut the book and clutching it to my person and rose to my feet. "Really, Miss Kenton," I said, "I must ask you to respect my privacy." "But why are you so shy about your book, Mrs. Stevens? I rather suspect it may be something rather racy." "It is quite out of the question, Miss Kenton, that anything racy, as you put it, should be found in his lordship's shelves. I have heard it said that many learned books contain the most racy passages, but I have never had the nerve to look. Now, Mr. Stevens, please do allow me to see what is it that you are reading." "Miss Kenton, I must ask you to leave me alone. It is quite impossible that you should persist in pursuing me like this during the very few moments of spare time I have for myself." But Miss Kenton was continuing to advance, and I must say that it was a little difficult to assess what my best course of action would be. I was tempted to thrust the book into the drawer of my desk and lock it, but this seems absurdly dramatic. I took a few paces back, and the book still held to my chest. "Please show me the volume you are reading, Mrs. Stevens," Miss Kenton said, continuing her advance, "and I will leave you to the pleasures of your reading. What on earth can it be you are so anxious to hide?" "Miss Kenton, whether or not you discover the title of this volume is in itself not the slightest importance to me, but as a matter of principle, I object to your appearing like this and invading my private moments." "I wonder if it is it a perfectly respectable volume, Mrs. Stevens? So, or are you, in fact, protecting me from its shocking influences?" Then she was standing before me, and suddenly the atmosphere underwent a peculiar change, almost as though the two of us had been suddenly thrust on to some other plane of being altogether. I'm afraid that it's not easy to describe clearly what I mean here. All I can say is that everything around us suddenly became very still, and it was my impression that Miss Kenton's manner also underwent a sudden change. There was a strange seriousness in her expression, and it struck me that she seemed almost frightened. "Please, Mr. Stevens, let me see your book." She reached forward and gently to release the volume from my grasp. I judged it best to look away while she did so, but with her person positioned so closely, this could only be achieved by twisting my head away at a somewhat unnatural angle. Miss Kenton continued very gentle to prise the book away, practically one finger at a time. The process seemed to take very long, throughout which I managed to maintain my posture until I finally heard her say, "Good gracious, Mr. Stevens! It isn't anything so scandalous at all. Simply a sentimental love story." I believe it was around this point that I decided there was no need to tolerate anymore. I cannot recall precisely what I said, but I remember showing Miss Kenton out of my pantry quite firmly, and the episode was thus brought to a close. I suppose I should add a few words here concerning the matter of the actual volume around this small episode revolve. The book was, true enough, what might be described as a sentimental romance, one of a number kept in the library, and also in several in the guest bedrooms for the entertainment of the lady visitors. There was a simple reason for my having taken to perusing such works. It was an extremely efficient way to maintain and develop one's command of the English language. It is my view, I do not know if you will agree, that in so far our generation is concerned, there has been too much stress placed on the professional desirability of good accent and command of language. That is to say, these elements have been stressed sometimes at the cost of more important professional qualities. For all that, it has never been my position that good accent and command of language are not attractive attributes, and I consider it my duty to develop them as best as I could. One straightforward means of going about this is simply to read a few pages of well-written book during odd spare moments one may have. This has been my own policy for some years, and I often tended to choose the sort of volume Miss Kenton had found me reading that evening simply because such work tend to be written in good English, with plenty of elegant dialogue of such practical value to me. A weightier book, a scholarly study, say, while it might have been more generally improving, would have tended to be couched in terms likely to be of more limited use of the course of one's normal intercourse with ladies and gentlemen. I rarely had the time or desire to read any of these romances cover to cover, but so far I could tell, their plots are invariably absurd, indeed sentimental, and I would not have wasted one moment on them were it not for these aforementioned benefits. Having said that, however, I do not mind confessing today, and I see nothing to be ashamed of in this, that I did at times gain a sort of incidental enjoyment from these stories. I did not perhaps acknowledge this to myself at the time, but as I say, what shame is there in it? Why one should not enjoy in a light-hearted sort of way stories of ladies and gentlemen who fall in love and express their feelings for each other, often in the most elegant phrases. But when I say this, I do not imply the stance I took over the matter of the book that evening was somehow unwarranted. For you must understand, there was an important principle at issue. The fact was, I had been off duty at the moment Miss Kenton had come marching into my pantry, and of course, any butler who regards his vocation with pride, any butler who aspires to all a dignity in keeping his position, as the Hay Society once put it, should never allow himself to be off duty in the presence of others. Hello, hello Kiko, nice to meet you. It was really immaterial whether it was Miss Kenton or a complete stranger who had walked in at that moment. A butler of any qualities must be seen to inhabit his role utterly and fully. He cannot be seen casting it aside one moment simply to don it again the next as though it was nothing more than a pantomime costume. There is one situation, and one situation only, in which a butler who cares about his dignity may feel free to unburden himself of this role, that is to say, when he is entirely alone. You will appreciate then that in the event of Miss Kenton bursting in at the time when I had presumed not unreasonably that I was to be alone, it came to be a crucial matter of principle, a matter indeed of dignity, that I did not appear in anything less than my full and proper role. However, it had not been my intention to analyze here the various facets of this small episode from years ago. The main point about it that it alerted to me that to the facts that things between Miss Kenton and myself had reached, no doubt, after a gradual process of many months, an inappropriate footing. The fact that she could behave as she had done that evening was rather alarming, and after I had seen her out of my pantry and had had a chance to gather my thoughts a little, I recalled resolving to set about re-establishing our professional relationship on a more proper basis. But as to just how much that incident contributed to the large changes of our relationships that subsequently underwent, it is very difficult now to say. There may be well have been other more fundamental developments to account for what took place, such as, for instance, the matter of Miss Kenton's day off. From the moment she arrived at Darlington Hall right up until perhaps a month or so before the incident in my pantry, Miss Kenton's days off had followed a predictable pattern. She would, once every 6 weeks, take 2 days off to visit her aunt in Southampton. Otherwise, following my own example, she would not really take days off as such, unless we were going through a particularly quiet time, in which case she might spend a day strolling around the grounds and doing a little reading in her parlour. But then, as I say, the pattern changed. She began suddenly to take full advantage of her contracted time off, disappearing regularly from the house from early in the morning and leaving no information other than the hour she might be expected back that night. Of course, she never took more time than her entitlement, thus I felt it improper to inquire further concerning these outings of hers. But I suppose this change did perturb me somewhat, for I remember mentioning it to Mr. Graham, valet butler to Sir James Chambers, a good colleague who incidentally I seem now to have lost touch with, as we sat talking by the fire one night during one of his regular visits to Darlington Hall. In fact, all I had said was something to the effect that the housekeeper had been a little moody lately, and so had been rather surprised when Mr. Graham nodded, leaned forward to me, and said knowingly, I had been wondering how much longer it would be. I asked him what he meant. Mr. Graham went on, Your Miss Kenton, I believe she's now what, 33, 34? Missed out on the best of her mothering years, but it's not too late yet. Miss Kenton, I assured him, is a devoted professional. I happen to know for a fact that she has no wish for a family. But Mr. Graham smiled and shook his head, saying, Never believe a housekeeper who tells you that she doesn't want a family. Indeed, Mr. Stevens, I should think you and I could sit here now and count up at least dozen between us that once said as such, then got married and left the profession. I recall I dismissed Mr. Graham's theory with some confidence that evening, but thereafter I admit I found it hard to keep it out of my mind the possibility that the purpose of these mysterious outings of Miss Kenton's was to meet a suitor. This was indeed a disturbing notion, for it was not hard to see Miss Kenton's departure would constitute a professional loss of some magnitude, a loss Darlington Hall would have some difficulty recovering from. Furthermore, I was obliged to recognize some certain other little signs which tended to support Mr. Graham's theory. For instance, the collection of mail being one of my duties, I could not help noticing Miss Kenton had started to get letters on a fairly regular basis, once a week or so, from the same correspondent, that these letters bore a local postmark. I should perhaps point out that it would have been well nigh impossible for me not to have noticed such a thing, given that throughout her preceding years at the house she had received very few letters indeed. Then there were other more nebulous signs to support Mr. Graham's view. For instance, although she continued to discharge her professional duties with all her usual diligence, her general mood tended to undergo swings of a sort I had hitherto never witnessed. In fact, the times when she became extremely cheerful on days on end and for no observable reason were almost as disturbing to me as a sudden, often prolonged sullen spells. As I say, she remained utterly professional throughout it all, but then again, it was my duty to think about the welfare of the house in the long term. And if indeed these signs tended to support Mr. Graham's notion that Miss Kenton was contemplating departing for romantic purposes, I clearly had a responsibility to probe the matter further. I did then venture to ask her one evening during one of our sessions over cocoa. "And you'll be off again on Tuesday, Miss Kenton, on your off day, I mean?" I had half expected her to be angry at this inquiry, but on the contrary, it's almost as though she had been long awaiting an opportunity to raise the very topic, for she said in something of a relieved way, "Oh, Mr. Stevens, it's just someone I knew once when I was at Grantchester Lodge. As a matter of fact, he was the butler there at the time, but now—" Thank you for the follow. Thank you. As a matter of fact, he was the butler there at the time, but now he has left service altogether and is employed by a business nearby. He somehow learned of my being here and started writing to me, suggesting we renew our acquaintance. And that, Mr. Stevens, is a really long and short of it. I see, Miss Kenton. No doubt, it is refreshing to leave the house at times. I find it so, Mr. Stevens. There was a short silence. Then Miss Kenton appeared to make some decision and went on. "This acquaintance of mine, I remember when he was a butler at the Grantchester Lodge, he was full of the most marvellous ambitions. In fact, I imagine his ultimate dream would have been to become the butler of a house like this. Oh, but when I think of some of his methods, really, Stevens, I can just imagine your face if you were to confronted by them now. It's no wonder his ambition remained unfulfilled." I gave a small laugh. "In my experience," I said, "too many people believe themselves capable of working at these higher levels without having the least idea of the exciting demands involved. It is certainly not suited to just anybody." "So true. Really, Mr. Stevens, what would you have said if you had observed him in those days?" "At these sort of levels, Miss Kenton, the professional isn't for everybody. It is easy enough to have lofty ambitions, but without certain qualities, a butler will simply not progress beyond a certain point." Miss Kenton seemed to ponder this for a moment, and then said, "It occurs—" Hello. Nice to meet you. It occurs to me you must be a well-contented man, Mr. Stevens. Here you are, after all, at the top of your profession, every aspect of your domain well under control. I really cannot imagine what more you might wish for in life. I could think no immediate response to this. In the slight awkward silence that ensued, Miss Kenton turned her gaze down into the depth of her cocoa cup, as if she had become engrossed by something she had noticed in there. In the end, after some consideration, I said, "As far as I am concerned, Miss Kenton, my vocation will not be fulfilled until I have done all I can to see his lordship through the great task he has set for himself. The day his lordship's work is complete, the day he is able to rest on his laurels, content in the knowledge that he has done all anyone could ever reasonably ask of him, only that day, Miss Kenton, I will be able to call myself, as you put it, a well-contented man." She may be a little puzzled by my words, or perhaps it was that they had for some reason displeased her. In any case, her mood seemed to change at that point, and our conversation rapidly lost the rather personal tone it had begun to adopt. It was not so long afterward that these meetings over cocoa in a parlour came to an end. In fact, I recall quite clearly the very last time we met like that. I was wishing to discuss with Miss Kenton a forthcoming event, a gathering of a distinguished persons from Scotland. It is true that the event was still a month away, but then it had always been our habit to talk over such events from an early stage. On this particular evening, I had been discussing various aspects of it for a little while, and while I realized Miss Kenton was contributing very little. Indeed, after some time, it became perfectly obvious her thoughts were somewhere else altogether. I did on a few occasions say things like, "Are you with me, Miss Kenton?" particularly if I had been making a lengthy point, and though whenever I did so she would become a little more alert, and within seconds I could see her attention drifting again. After several minutes of my talking and her contributing again only statements such as, "Of course, Mr. Stevens," or "I quite agree, Mr. Stevens," I finally said to her, "I'm sorry, Miss Kenton, but I see little point in our continuing. You simply do not seem to appreciate the importance of this discussion." "I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens," she said, sitting up a little. "It's simply that I'm rather tired this evening." "You are increasingly tired now, Miss Kenton. It used not to be an excuse you needed to resort to." To my astonishment, Miss Kenton responded to this in a sudden burst. "Mr. Stevens, I've had a very busy week. I am very tired. In fact, I've been wishing my bed for the last 3 or 4 hours. I am very, very tired, Mr. Stevens. Can you not appreciate that?" It is not as though I had expected an apology from her, but the stridency of this reply did, I must say, take me aback a little. However, I decided not to get drawn into the unseemly argument with her, and made sure to pause for a telling moment or two before saying quite calmly, "If that is how you feel about it, Miss Kenton, there is no need at all for us to continue with these evening meetings. I am sorry that all this time I had no idea of the extent of which they were inconveniencing you." "Mr. Stevens, I merely said that I was tired tonight." No, Miss Kenton, it's perfectly understandable. You have a busy life, and these meetings are quite unnecessary addition to your burden. There are many alternative options for achieving the level of professional communication necessary without our meeting on this basis." Mr. Stevens, this is quite unnecessary. I merely said, I mean it, Miss Kenton. In fact, I have been wondering for some time if we should not discontinue these meetings, given how they prolong our already busy days. The fact that we have met here now for years is no reason in itself why we should not seek more convenient arrangement from here on. Mr. Stevens, please, I believe these meetings are very useful. But they are inconvenient for you, Miss Kenton. They tire you out. May I suggest that from now on we simply make a special point communicating important important information during the course of a normal working day. Should we not be able to find each other readily? I suggest we leave written messages at one another's door. That seems to me a perfectly fine solution. Now, Miss Kenton, I apologize for keeping you up for so long. Thank you for very kindly for the cocoa. Naturally, and why should I not admit this? I have occasionally wondered to myself how things might have turned out in the long run had I not been so determined over the issue of our evening's meetings. That is to say, had I relented on those several occasions over the weeks that followed when Miss Kenton suggested we reinstitute them. I only speculate over this now because, in the light of the subsequent events, it could very well be argued that in the making of my decision to end those evening meetings once and for all, I was perhaps not entirely aware of the full implication of what I was doing. Indeed, it might even be said that this small decision of mine constituted something of a key turning point, that the decision set things on an inevitable course towards what eventually happened. But then, I suppose, when with the benefit of one hindsight one begins to search one's past for such turning points, one is apt to start seeing them everywhere. Not only my decision in respect of our evening meetings, but also that episode in my pantry, if felt so inclined, could be seen as such a turning point. What would have transpired, one may ask, had one responded slightly different that evening she came in with her vase of flowers, and perhaps occurring as it did around the time as these events, my encounter with Miss Kenton in the Nice to meet you, Shiro Cat. Hello, thank you. Thank you for being here. What would have transpired, one may ask, had one responded slightly differently that evening she came in with her vase of flowers, and perhaps occurring as it did around the same time as these events, my encounter with Miss Kenton in the dining room that afternoon she received the news of her aunt's death might be seen.
Stretch.
Alright. Okay. Okay, a sip of coffee. Oh, thank you guys for being here. Okay. And perhaps occurring as it did around the same time as these events, my encounter with Miss Kenton in the dining room, the afternoon she received the news of her aunt's death might be seen as yet another turning point of sorts. News of death had arrived some hours earlier. Indeed, I myself had knocked on the door of her parlor that morning to hand her the letter. I had stepped inside for a brief moment to discuss some professional matter, and I recall we were seated at her table in mid-conversation at the moment she opened the letter. She became very still, but to her credit she remained composed, reading the letter through at least twice. Then she put the letter carefully back into the envelope and looked across the table to me. "It is from Mrs. Johnson, a companion of my aunt. She said that my aunt died the day before yesterday." She paused for a moment, then said, "The funeral is to take place tomorrow. I wonder if it might be possible for me to take the day off." "I'm sure that could be arranged, Miss Kenton." "Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Forgive me, but perhaps I may now have a few moments alone." "Of course, Miss Kenton." I made my exit, and it was not long until after I had done so that it occurred to me that I had not actually offered her my condolences. I could well imagine the blow the news would be to her aunt having been, to all intents and purposes, like a mother to her. And I paused out in the corridor, wondering if I should go back, knock and make a good omission. But then it occurred to me that if I were to do so, I might easily intrude upon her private grief. Indeed, it was not impossible that Miss Kenton at that very moment, and only a few feet away from me, was actually crying. The thought provoked a strange feeling to rise within me, causing me to stand there hovering in the corridor for some moments. But eventually I judged it best to await another opportunity to express my sympathy and went on my way. As it turned out, I did not see her again until the afternoon. When I say I came across her in the dining room, replacing crockery in the sideboard. By this point, I had been preoccupied for some hours with the matter of Miss Kenton's sorrow, having given particular thought to the question of what I might best do or say to eat. Thank you. Thank you for the follow. Thank you. Might say to ease her burden a little. And when I had heard her footsteps entering the dining room, I was busy with some task out in the hall. I had waited a minute or so, then put down what I was doing and followed her in. "Ah, Miss Kenton," I said, "and how might you be this afternoon?" "Quite well, thank you, Mr. Stevens. Is everything in order?" "Everything's in order, thank you." "I had been meaning to ask you if you were experiencing any particular problems with the new recruits." I gave a small laugh. "Various small difficulties are apt to arise when so many recruits arrive at once. I dare say the best of us can often profit by a little professional discussion at such times." "Thank you, Mr. Stevens, but the new girls are very satisfactory to me." "You don't consider any changes necessary to the present staff plans on account of the recent arrivals?" "I don't think any changes will be necessary, Mr. Stevens. However, if I change my view on this, I will let you know immediately." She turned her attention back to the sideboard, and for a moment I thought about leaving the dining room. In fact, I believe I actually took a few steps towards the doorway, but I turned to her again and said, "So, Miss Kenton, the new recruits are getting on well, you say?" "They're both doing very well, I assure you." "Ah, that's good to hear." I gave another short laugh. I merely wondered because we had established that neither girl had worked previously in a house of this size. "Indeed, Mr. Stevens." I watched her filling the sideboard and waited to see if she would say anything further. When after several moments it became clear that she would not, I said, "As a matter of fact, Miss Kenton, I have to say this. I noticed one or two things have fallen in standard just recently. I do feel you might be a little less complacent as regards new arrivals." "Whatever do you mean, Mr. Stevens?" "For my part, Miss Kenton, whenever a new recruit arrive, I like to make doubly sure all is well. I check all the aspects of their work and try to gauge how they are conducting themselves with other staff members. It is, after all, important to form a clear view of them both technically and in terms of their impact on general morale. I regret to say this, Miss Kenton, but I believe you have been a little remiss in this respect." For a second, Miss Kenton looked confused. Then she turned towards me with a sudden strain visible in her face. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Stevens." "For instance, Miss Kenton, although the crockery is being washed to as high standard as ever, I have noticed that it is being replaced on the kitchen shelf in a manner which, while not obviously dangerous, would nevertheless over time result in more breakages than necessary." "Is that so, Mr. Stevens?" "Yes, Miss Kenton. Furthermore, that a little alcove outside the breakfast room has not been dusted for some time. You will excuse me, but there are one or two small other things I might mention." "You need not press your point, Mr. Stevens. I will, as you suggest, check the work of the new maids. It is not like you to have overlooked such obvious things, Miss Kenton." Miss Kenton looked away from me, and then an expression crossed her face as though she was trying to puzzle out something that had quite confused her. She did not look upset, so much as very wary. Then she closed the sideboard, said, "Please excuse me, Mr. Stevens," and left the room. But what is the sense in forever speculating what might have happened had such and such moment turned out differently? One could presumably drive oneself to distraction in this way. In any case, while it is all very well to talk about turning points, one can surely only recognize such moments in retrospect. Naturally, when one looks back to such instances today, they may indeed take the appearance of being crucial, precious moments in one's life, but of course, at the time, this was not the impression one had. Rather, it was as though one had available a never-ending number of days, months, years in which to sort out the vagaries of one's relationship with Miss Kenton, an infinite number of further opportunities in which to remedy the effect of this or that misunderstanding. There was surely nothing to indicate at the time that such evidently small incidents would render a whole dreams forever irredeemable. But I see I am becoming unduly introspective, and in a rather morose sort of way at that. No doubt. This has to do with the late hour and the trying nature of events I have to endure the evening. No doubt, too, my present mood is not unconnected with the fact that tomorrow, provided I am supplied with petrol by the local garage, as the tailors assured I will be, I should arrive in Little Compton by lunchtime, and I will, presumably, see Miss Kenton again after all these years. There is, of course, no reason at all to suppose our meeting will be anything but cordial. In fact, I would expect our interview, aside from very few informal exchanges quite proper in the circumstances, to be largely professional in character. That is to say, it will be my responsibility to determine whether or not Miss Kenton has any interest now that her marriage sadly appears to have broken down and she is now without a home, is returning to her old post at Darlington Hall. I may as well say here that I have reread her letter again tonight. I am inclined to believe that I may well have read more into certain of her lines than perhaps was wise. But I would still maintain there is more than a hint of nostalgic longing in certain parts of her letter, particularly when she writes such things as, "I was so fond of that view from the second floor bedrooms overlooking the lawn with the downs visible in the distance." But then again, what is the purpose of endlessly speculating as to Miss Kenton's present wishes when I will be able to ascertain this from her own person tomorrow? And in any case, I have drifted considerably from the account I was giving of this evening's presence. These last few hours, let me say it, have proved unreasonably taxing ones. One would have thought that having to abandon the fort on some lonely hill, having to walk down to this village in the near darkness by the unorthodox route one did, would be sufficient inconvenience to befall one for a single evening. And my kind host, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, would never, I am certain, have knowingly put me through what I have just endured. But the fact is, once I had sat down to supper at their table, once a number of their neighbors had come calling, a most discomforting set of events began to unfold around me. The room downstairs at the front of this cottage would appear to serve Mr. and Mrs. Taylor as both dining room and general living quarters. It is rather cozy room, dominated by large, roughly hewn table of the sort of one might expect to see in a farmhouse kitchen, in surface unvarnished and bearing many small marks left by choppers and bread knives. This latter I could see quite clearly, despite the fact that we were sitting in a low yellow light cast by an oil lamp on a shelf in one corner. "It is not as though we don't have electricity out here, sir," Mr. Taylor remarked to me at one point, nodding towards the lamp. "But something went wrong with the circuit, and we have been without it for almost 2 months now. To tell you the truth, we don't miss it much. There's a few houses in the village that's never had electricity at all. Oil give us warmer lights." Mrs. Taylor had served us with good broth, which we had eaten with heapings of crusty breads, and at that point there had been little to suggest that evening held for me anything more daunting than an hour or so pleasant conversation before retiring to bed. However, just as we finished supper and Mr. Taylor was pouring for me a glass of ale brewed by a neighbor, we heard footsteps approaching by the gravel outside. To my ears, there was something a little sinister in the sound of a feet coming ever closer in the darkness up to an isolated cottage. But neither my host nor hostess seemed to anticipate any menace, for it was curiosity and nothing else in his voice that Mr. Taylor said, "Hello! Now who could this be?" He said this in a more or less to himself, but then we heard, as though in reply, a voice called outside, "It's George Andrews! Just happened to be walking by." The next moment, Mrs. Taylor was showing in a well-built man, perhaps in his 50s, who, judging from his dress, had spent the day engaged in agricultural work. With familiarity which suggested that he was a regular visitor, he placed himself on a small stool by the entrance and removed his Wellington boots with some effort, exchanging a few casual remarks with Mrs. Taylor as he did so. Then he came towards the table and stopped, standing to attention before me as though reporting to an officer in the army. "The name's Andrew, sir," he said. "A very good evening to you. I'm very sorry to hear about your mishap, and I hope you're not too put out to be spending the night here in the Moscombe." I was a little puzzled as to how this Mr. Andrews had come to hear of my mishap, as he termed it. In any case, I replied with a smile that, far from being put out, I felt extremely indebted for the hospitality that I was receiving. By this I had, of course, been referring to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor's kindness, but Mr. Andrews seems to believe himself included by my expression of gratitude. For, he said immediately, holding up defensively his two large hands, "Oh, no, sir, you're most welcome. We are very pleased to have you. It's not often the likes of yourself comes through here. We are all very pleased you could stop by." The way he said this seemed to suggest the whole village was aware of my mishap and subsequent arrival at this cottage. In fact, I was soon to discover that this was very close to being the case. I can only imagine that in several minutes after I had first shown up to my room, while I was washing my hands and doing what I could to make good the damage inflicted upon my jacket and trousers turn-ups, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor had conveyed the news of me to the passerbys. In any case, the next few minutes saw the arrival of another visitor, a man with an appearance much like that of Mr. Andrews, that is to say, somewhat broad and agricultural and wearing muddy Wellington boots, which he proceeded to remove in much the way Mr. Andrew had just done. Indeed, the similarity was such that I supposed them to be brothers until the newcomer introduced himself to me as "Morgan, sir, Trevor Morgan." Mr. Morgan expressed regret concerning my misfortune, and assuring me all would be well in the morning, before going on to say how welcome I was in the village. Of course, I had already heard similar sentiments a few moments earlier, but Mr. Morgan actually said, "It's a privilege to have a gentleman like yourself here in Moscow, sir." Before I had had any time to think a reply to this, there came a sound of more footsteps on the path outside. Soon, a middle-aged couple were shown in, who were introduced to me as Mr. and Mrs. Harry Smith. These people did not look at all agricultural. She was a large, matronly woman who rather reminded me of Mrs. Mortimer, the cook at Darlington Hall, through much of the 20s and 30s. In contrast, Mr. Harry Smith was a small man with a rather intense expression that furrowed his brow. As they took their places around the table, he said to me, "Your car could be the vintage Ford up there at the Thornley Bush Hill, sir." "If that's the hill overlooking this village," I said. "But I'm surprised to hear you have seen it." "I've not seen it myself, sir, but Dave Thornton passed it on his tractor a short while ago as he was coming home. He was surprised to see it sitting there. He actually stopped and got out." At this point, Mr. Harry Smith turned to address others around the room. "Absolute beauty it is," said he had never seen anything like it. put the car Mr. Lindsay used to drive completely in the shade. This caused laughter around the table, which Mr. Taylor explained to me by saying, there was a gent who lived in the big house not far from here, sir. He did one or two odd things and wasn't appreciated around here. This brought a general murmur of assent. Then someone said, "Your health, sir," lifting one of the tankards of ale Mrs. Taylor had just finished distributing, and the next moment I was being toasted by the whole company. I smiled and said, "I assure you the privilege is all mine." "You're very kind, sir," Mrs. Smith said. That's the way a real gentleman is. That Mr. Lindsay was no gentleman. He may have a lot of money, but he was never a gentleman. Again, there was an agreement all around. Then Mrs. Taylor whispered something in Mrs. Smith's ear, causing the latter to reply. He said that he would try to be along as soon as he could. They both turned towards me with a self-conscious air. Then Mrs. Smith said, "We told Dr. Carlyle you were here, sir. The doctor will be very pleased to make your acquaintance. I expect he has patients to see," Mrs. Taylor added apologetically. "I'm afraid we can't say for certain he'll be able to call in before you are wanting more to retire, sir." It was then that Mr. Harry Smith, the little man with the furrowed brows, leaned forward and said, "That Mr. Lindsay, he had it all wrong, you see, acting the way he did. Thought he was so much better than us. He took us all for fools. Well, I can tell you, sir, he soon learned otherwise. A lot of hard thinking and talking goes on in this place. There's a plenty of good strong opinion around here, and people here aren't shy about expressing it." Sorry. "There's something your Mr. Lindsay learned quickly enough." "He was no gentleman," Mr. Taylor said quietly. "He was no gentleman, that Mr. Lindsay." "That's right, sir," Mr. Harry Smith said. "You could tell just watching him. He was no gentleman. All right, he had a fine house and good suits, but somehow you just knew, and so it proved in good time." There was murmur of agreement, and for a moment a present seemed to be considering whether or not it would be proper to divulge to me the tale concerning this local personage. Then Mr. Taylor broke the silence by saying, "That's true what Harry says. You could tell a true gentleman from a false one than that's just dressed in finery. Take yourself, sir. It's not just the cut of your clothes, nor is it even the fine way you have got of speaking. There's something else that marks you out as a gentleman. Hard to put your finger on it, but it's plain for all to see that's got eyes." This brought more sounds of agreements around the table. "Dr. Carlyle shouldn't be long now, sir," Mrs. Taylor put in. "You will enjoy talking with him." Dr. Carlyle's got it too," Mr. Taylor said. "He's got it. He's a true gent, that one." Mr. Morgan, who had little to say since his arrival, bent forward and said to me, "What do you suppose it is, sir?" "Maybe one that's got it can better say what it is. Here we are all talking about who's got it and who hasn't, but we are none the wiser about what we are talking about. Perhaps you could enlighten us a bit, sir." A silence fell around the table, and I could sense the faces turn to me. I gave a small cough and said, "It is hardly for me to pronounce upon qualities I may or may not possess. However, as far as this particular question concerned, one would suspect the quality being referred to might be most usefully termed as dignity." I saw little point in attempting to explain this statement further. Indeed, I had merely given a voice to the thoughts running through my mind while listening to these preceding talks, and it is doubtful that I would have said such a thing that had the situation not suddenly demanded of me. My response, however, seemed to cause such much satisfaction. "There's a lot of truth in what you say there, sir," Mr. Andrews said, nodding, and a number of other voices echoed this. "That Mr. Lindsay could certainly have done with a little more dignity," Mrs. Taylor said. "The trouble with this sort is that they mistake acting high and mighty for dignity. Mind you," put in Mr. Harry Smith, With all respect for what you say, sir, it ought to be said, dignity isn't just something gentlemen have. Dignity is something every man and woman in this country can strive for and get. You'll excuse me, sir, but like I said before, we don't stand on ceremony here when it comes to expressing opinions, and that's my opinion for what it's worth. Dignity is not just something for gentlemen. I perceive, of course, that Mr. Harry Smith and I were rather at cross purposes on this matter, and that it would be far too complicated a task for me to explain myself more clearly to these people. I thus judged it simply best to smile and say, "Of course, you are quite right." And this had the immediate effect of dispelling the slight tension that had built in the room while Mr. Harry Smith had been speaking, and Mr. Harry Smith himself seemed to lose all inhibitions, for now he leaned forward and continued. That's what we fought Hitler for, after all. If Hitler had things done his way, we would just be his slaves now. The whole country would be a few masters and millions upon millions of slaves. And I don't need to remind anyone here, there's no dignity to be had in being slave. That's what we fought for, and that's what we won. We won the rights to be free citizens, and it's one of those privileges of being born English that no matter who you are, no matter if you are rich or poor, you are born free, and you're born so that you can express your opinion freely and vote for your member of parliament and vote him out. That's what dignity is really about, if you'll excuse me, sir. Now, Harry, Mr. Taylor said, I can see that you are warming up to one of your political speeches. This brought laughter. Mr. Harry Smith smiled a little shyly but went on. I'm not talking about politics. I'm just saying, that's all. You can't have dignity if you are a slave. But every Englishman can grasp it if only he cares to. Because we fought for that right. This may seem small, out of the way place we have here, sir, his wife said. But we gave more than our share in the war. More than our share. A solemnness hung in the air after she said this until eventually Mr. Taylor said to me, Harry does a lot for organizing for our local member. Give him half a chance and he'll tell you everything that's wrong with the way the country's run. Ah, but I was just saying what was right about the country this time. Have you had much to do with politics yourself, sir? Mr. Andrews asked. Not directly as such, I said, and particularly not these days. More so before the war, perhaps. It's just that I seem to remember a Mr. Stevens, who was a member of Parliament just a year or two ago. Heard him on the wireless once or twice. Has some very sensible things to say about housing. But that wouldn't be you, sir. Oh, no, I say with a laugh, now that I'm not at all sure what made me utter my next sentence. All I can say is that it seemed somehow called for the circumstances in which I found myself. For then, I said, in fact, I tended to concern myself with international affairs more than domestic ones. Foreign policy, that is to say. I was a little taken aback by the effect this seemed to have upon my listeners. That is to say, a sense of awe seemed to descend them. I quickly added, I never held any high office, mind you. Any influence I asserted was in strictly unofficial capacity. But the hushed silence remained for a few more seconds. Excuse me, sir, Mrs. Taylor said eventually, but have you ever met Mr. Churchill? Mr. Churchill? He did come to the house on a number of occasions, but to be frank, Mrs. Taylor, during the time I was most involved in great affairs, Mr. Churchill was not such a key figure, and was not really expected to become one. The likes of Mr. Eden and Lord Halifax were more frequent visitors in those days. But you have actually met Mr. Churchill, sir. What an honor to be able to say that. I don't agree with many things Mr. Churchill says, Mr. Harry Smith said, but there's no doubt about it. He's a great man. It must be quite something, sir, to be discussing matters with his like. Well, I must reiterate, I said, I didn't have a great deal to do with Mr. Churchill. But as you rightly point out, it's rather gratifying to have consorted with him. In fact, all in all, I suppose I have been very fortunate. I will be the first to admit that. It has been my good fortune, after all, to have consulted not just with Mr. Churchill, but with many other great leaders and men of influence from America and Europe. And when you think that it was my good fortune to have their ear on many great issues of the day, yes, when I think back, I do feel a certain gratitude. It's a great privilege, after all, to have been given a part to play, however small, on the world stage. Excuse me for asking, sir, Mr. Andrews said, but what sort of man is Mr. Eden? I mean, at the personal level, I've always had the impression he's a jolly decent fellow. The sort that can talk to anyone high and low, rich or poor. Am I right, sir? I would say that is, by and large, an accurate picture. But of course, I've never seen Mr. Eden in recent years. He may have changed. He may have been much changed by pressures. One thing I have witnessed is that public life can change person unrecognizably in a few short years. I don't doubt that, sir, said Mr. Andrews. Even Harry here got himself involved with politics a few years back, and he's never been the same man since. There's a laughter again, while Mr. Harry Smith shrugged and allowed a smile to cross his face. Then he said, "It's true. I've put a lot into campaigning work. It's only at a local level, and I never met anyone half as grand as the likes of you associated with. But in my own small way, I believe I'm doing my part. The way I see it, England's democracy, and in this village we have suffered as much as anyone fighting to keep it that way. Now, it's up to us to exercise our rights, every one of us. Some fine young lads from this village gave up their lives to give us a privilege, and the way I see it, each one of us here now owes it to them to play our part. We have all got strong opinions here, and it's our responsibility to get them heard. We are out of the way, all right, a small village. We are none of us getting younger, and the village is getting smaller. But the way I see it, we owe it to the lads we lost from this village. That's why, sir, I give so much of my time now to making sure our voice get heard in high places. And if it changes me and send me to an early grave, I don't mind." "I did warn you, sir," Mr. Taylor said with a smile. "There was no way Harry was going to let an influential gentleman like yourself come through the village without giving you his usual earful." There was a laughter again, and I said almost immediately, "I think I understand your position well, Mr. Smith. I can well understand that you wish the world to be a better place, and that you and your fellow residents here should have an opportunity to contribute to the making of a better world. It is a sentiment to be applauded. I dare say it was very similar urge which led me to become involved in great affairs before the war. Then, as now, world peace seems something we had only the most fragile grasp of, and I wish to do my part." "Excuse me, sir," said Mr. Harry Smith, "but my point was a slightly different one. For the likes of you, it's always been easy to exert your influence. You can count on the most powerful in the land as your friends, but for the likes of us here, sir, we can go a year in and out and never lay eyes on a real gentleman, other than maybe Dr. Carlyle. He's a first-class doctor, but with all respect, he doesn't have connections and such. It gets easy for us here to forget our responsibility as citizens. That's why I work hard at campaigning, whether people agree or disagree, and I know there's not one soul in this room now who would agree with everything I say. At least I'll get them to thinking. At least I'll remind them of their duty. This is a democratic country we are living in. We fought for it. We have all got to play our parts." "I wonder what could have happened to Dr. Carlyle," Mrs. Smith said. "I'm sure the gentleman could just use some educated talk now." This provoked more laughter. "In fact," I said, "although it has been extremely enjoyable to meet you all, I must confess I am beginning to feel rather exhausted." "Of course, sir," Mrs. Taylor said, "you must be very tired. Perhaps I'll fetch another blanket for you. It gets much chillier at night now." "No, I assure you, Mrs. Taylor, I'll be most comfortable. But before I could arise from the table, Mr. Morgan said, "I just wondered, sir, there's a fellow we'd like to listen to on the wireless. His name is Leslie Mandrake. I wonder if you had happened to have met him." I replied that I had not, and was about to make another attempt to retire, only to find myself detained by further inquiries regarding various persons I may have met. I was then still seated at the table when Mrs. Smith remarked, "Ah, there's someone coming. I expect that's the doctor at last." "I really ought to be retiring," I said. "I feel quite exhausted." "But I'm sure this is a doctor now, sir," said Mrs. Smith. "Do wait a few more minutes." Just as she said this, there comes a knock, and the boy said, "It's just me, Mrs. Taylor." The gentleman, who was shown in still fairly young, perhaps around 40 or so, tall and thin, tall enough in fact that he was obliged to stoop to enter the doorway of the cottage. No sooner had he bade us all good evening, and Mrs. Taylor said to him, "This is our gentleman here, doctor. His car struck up there at the thornly bush, and he's having to endure Harry's speeches as a result." The doctor came up to the table and held out his hand to me. "Richard Carlyle," he said, with a cheerful smile as I rose to shake it. "Rotten bit luck about your car. Still, trust you're being well looked after here. Well, look after rather too well, I imagine." "Thank you," I replied. "Everyone has been most kind." "Very well. Nice to have you with us." Dr. Carlyle seated himself almost directly across the table from me. "Which part of the country are you from?" "Oxfordshire," I said, and indeed it was no easy task to suppress the instinct to add "sir." "Fine part of the country. I have an uncle lives just outside Oxford." "Fine part of the country. The gentleman was just telling us, doctor," Mrs. Smith said. "He knows Mr. Churchill." "Is that so? I used to know a nephew of his, but I rather lost touch. Never had the privilege of meeting the great man, though." "Not only Mr. Churchill," Mrs. Smith went on. "He knows Mr. Eden and Lord Halifax." "Really?" I could see the doctor's eyes examining me closely. I was about to make some appropriate remark, but before I could do so, Mr. Andrews said to the doctor, "Gentleman was just telling us he had a lot to do with foreign affairs in his time." Is that so indeed?" It seemed to me that Dr. Carlyle went on looking at me for an inordinate length of time. Then he regained his cheerful manner and asked, "Touring around for pleasure?" "Principally," I said, and gave a small laugh. "Plenty of nice country around here. Oh, and by the way, Mr. Andrews, I'm sorry to not have returned that saw yet." "No need to hurry, doctor." For a little time the focused attention left me, and I was able to remain silent. Then, seizing what seemed to be a suitable moment, I rose to my feet, saying, "Please excuse me. It has been the most enjoyable evening, but I must really retire now." "Such a pity you have to retire already, sir," Mrs. Smith said. "The doctor has just arrived." Mr. Harry Smith leaned across his wife and said to Dr. Carlyle, "I was hoping the gentleman would have a few words to say about your ideas about the Empire, doctor." Then turned to me. He went on, "Our doctor's hears for all kinds of little countries going independent. I don't have the learning to prove him wrong, though I know he is, but I have been interested to hear what the likes of you yourself have to say to him on the subject, sir." Yet again, Dr. Carlyle's gaze seemed to study me. Then he said, "A pity, but we must let a gentleman go off to bed. Had a tiring day, I expect." "Indeed," I said, with a small laugh, and began to make my way around the table. To my embarrassment, everyone in the room, including Dr. Carlyle, rose to their feet. "Thank you all very much," I said, smiling. "Mrs. Taylor, I did enjoy a splendid supper. I wish you all a very good night." Then came a chorus of "Good night, sir," in reply. I had almost left the room when the doctor's voice caused me to halt at the door. "I say, old chap," he said, and when I returned, I saw he had remained on his feet. "I have a visit to make in Stansbury first thing in the morning. I'll be happy to give you a lift up to your car, save you the walk, and we can pick up a can of petrol from Ted Hot Airs on the way." "That is most kind," I said, "but I don't wish to put you to any trouble."
No trouble at all. 7:30 all right with you? That would be most helpful indeed. Right then, 7:30 it is. Make sure your guests up and breakfasted for 7:30, Mrs. Taylor. Then turning back to me, he added, so we can have our talk after all. Though Harry here won't have the satisfaction. Thank you. A little bit more to go. Though Harry here won't have the satisfaction of witnessing my humiliation. There was a laughter and another exchange of good nights before I was at last allowed to ascend to the sanctuary of this room. I trust I need hardly underline the extent of discomfort I suffered tonight on the account of the unfortunate misunderstanding concerning my person. I can only say now that, in all honesty, I fail to see how I might reasonably have prevented the situation developing as it did. For, by the stage, I had become aware of what was occurring. Things had gone so far I could not have enlightened these people without creating much embarrassment all around. In any case, regrettable as the whole business was, I do not see that any real harm was being done. I presumably never encountered them again, and there seems little point in dwelling on the matter. However, the unfortunate misunderstanding aside, there are perhaps one or two other aspects to this evening's events which warrant a few moments' thoughts, if only because otherwise they may become to niggle one throughout the coming days. For instance, there is the matter of Mr. Harry Smith's pronouncements on the nature of dignity. There's surely little in his statement that merits serious consideration. Of course, one has to allow Mr. Harry Smith was employing the word dignity in a quite different sense altogether from my own understanding of it. Even so, sorry. Sorry. Even taken on their own terms, his statements were surely far too idealistic, far too theoretical to deserve respect. Up to a point, no doubt there is some truth in what he says. In a country such as ours, people may indeed have a certain duty to think about great affairs and form their opinions, but life being what it is, how can ordinary people truly be expected to have strong opinions on all matter of things, as Mr. Harry Smith rather fancifully claims the villagers here do? And not only are these expectations unrealistic, I rather doubt if they are even desirable. There is, after all, a real limit to how much ordinary people can learn and know. And to demand that each and every one of them contributes strong opinions to the great debates of the nation cannot surely be wise. It is, in any case, absurd that anyone presume to define a person's dignity in these terms. As it happens, there is an instance that comes to mind which I believe illustrates rather well the real limits of which truth may be contained in Mr. Harry Smith's views. It is, as it happens, an instance from my own experience, an episode that took place before the war around 1935. As I recall, I was rung for late one night. It was past midnight. The drawing room where his lordship had been entertaining 3 gentlemen since dinner. I had, naturally, been called to the drawing room several times already that night to replenish refreshments, and had observed on this occasion that the gentlemen deep in conversation over weighty issues. When I entered the drawing room on this last occasion, however, all the gentlemen stopped talking and looked at me. Then the lordship said, "Step this way a moment, will you, Stevens? Mr. Spencer here wishes a word with you." The gentleman in question went on gazing at me for a moment without changing somewhat the languid posture that he had adopted in his armchair. Then he said, "My good man, I have a question for you. We need your help on certain matter we have been debating. Tell me, do you suppose the debt situation regarding America is significant factor in the present low levels of trade? Or do you suppose this is a red herring that the abandonment of the gold standard is at the root of the matter? I was naturally a little surprised by this, but then quickly saw the situation for what it was. That is to say, it was for me, clearly expected that I'd be baffled by the question. However, in the moment or so that it took me to perceive this and compose a suitable response, I may even have given the outward impression of struggling with the question, for I saw the gentleman in the room exchange mirthful smile. Hey, I know who you are. Have a seat. I'm very sorry, sir, I said, but I'm unable to be of assistance on this matter. I was, by this point, well on top of the situation, but the gentleman went on laughing covertly. Then Mr. Spencer said, "Then perhaps you will help us on another matter. Would you say that the currency problem in Europe would be better or worse if there were to be an arms agreement between the French and the Bolsheviks?" "I'm very sorry, sir, but I am unable to be of assistance on this matter." "Oh dear," said Mr. Spencer. "So you can't help us here either." There was more suppressed laughter before his lordship said, "Very well, Stevens, that will be all." "Please, Darlington, I have one more question to put to our good man here," Mr. Spencer said. "I very much wanted his help on the question vexing many of us, and which we all realize is crucial to how we should shape our foreign policy. My good fellows, please come to our assistance. What was M. Laval really intending by his recent speech on the situation in North Africa? Are you also of the view that it was simply a ruse to scupper the nationalist fringe of his own domestic party?" "I'm sorry, sir, but I am unable to assist on this matter." "You see, gentlemen," Mr. Spencer said, turning to the others, "our man is unable to assist us in these matters." This brought fresh laughter, now barely suppressed. "And yet," Mr. Spencer went on, "we still persist with the notion that this nation's decision be left in the hands of our good man here and to the few millions others like him. Is it any wonder, saddled as we are with our present parliament system, and we are unable to find solution to our many difficulties? Why, you may as well ask a committee of the Mothers' Union to organize the war campaign." There was an open, hearty laughter at this remark, during which my lordship muttered, "Thank you, Stevens," thus enabling me to take my leave. While of course this was likely an uncomfortable situation, it was hardly the most difficult, or even an especially unusual one to encounter in the course of one's duty. Okay. One's duty. And you will, no doubt, agree that any decent professional should expect to take such events in his stride. I had then all but forgotten the episode by the following morning, when Lord Darlington came into the billiard room when I was on the step ladder dusting portraits, and said, "Look here, Stevens, it was dreadful, the ordeal we put you through last night." I paused in what I was doing and said, "Not at all, sir. I was only too happy to be of service." "It was quite dreadful. We had all had rather too good a dinner, I fancy. Please accept my apologies." "Thank you, sir. But I'm happy to assure you that I was not unduly inconvenienced." His lordship walked over rather wearily to a leather armchair, seated himself, and sighed. From my vantage point, up on my ladder, I could see practically the whole of his long figure caught in the winter sunshine pouring in through the French windows and streaking much of the room. It was, as I call it, one of those moments that brought home how much the pressures of life had taken their toll on his lordship over a relatively small number of years. His frame, always slender, had become alarmingly thin and somewhat misshapen. His hair, prematurely white, his face strained and haggard. For a while he sat gazing out at the French windows towards the downs, and said it again. It really was quite dreadful. But you see, Stevens, Mr. Spencer had a point to prove to Sir Leonard. In fact, if it's any consolation, you did assisting in demonstrating a very important point. Sir Leonard had been talking a lot about the old-fashioned nonsense, about the will of the people being the wise arbitrator and so on. Would you believe it, Stevens? Indeed, sir. We are really so slow in this country to recognize when a thing's outmoded. Other great nations know full well that to meet the challenges of each new age means discarding old, sometimes well-loved methods. Not here in the Britain. There's still so many talking like Sir Leonard last night. That's why Mr. Spencer felt the need to demonstrate his points. And I tell you, Stevens, if the likes of Sir Leonard are to make made awake and think a little, then you can take it from me that your ordeal last night was not in vain. Indeed, sir. Lord Darlington gave another sigh. We are always the last, Stevens. Always the last to be clinging on to outmoded the system. But sooner or later, we'll need to face up to facts. Democracy is something for the bygone era. The world's far too complicated a place now for universal suffrage and such like. For endless members of parliament debating things to a standstill. All fine a few years ago, but in today's world, what was it Mr. Spencer said last night? He put it rather well. I believe, sir, he compared the present parliament system to a committee of mothers' union attempting to organize a war campaign. Exactly, Stevens. We are, quite frankly, behind the times in this country. And it's imperative that all forward-looking people impress this on the likes of Sir Leonard. Indeed, sir. I ask you, Stevens, here we are in the midst of continuing crisis. I've seen it with my own eyes when I went north with Mr. Whittaker. People are suffering. Ordinary, decent working people are suffering terribly. Germany and Italy have set their houses in order by acting. And so have the wretched Bolsheviks in their own way, one supposes. Even President Roosevelt. Look at him. He's not afraid to take a few bold steps on behalf of his people. But look at us here, Stevens. Year after year goes by. Nothing gets better. All we do is argue and debate and procrastinate. Any decent idea is amended to ineffectuality by the time it's gone halfway through the various committees it's obliged to pass through. The few people qualified to know what's what are talked to a standstill by ignorant people all around them. What do you make of it, Stevens? The nation does seem to be in regrettable condition, sir. I'll say. Look at Germany and Italy, Stevens. See what strong leadership can do if it's allowed to act. None of this new universal suffrage is nonsense there. If your house is on fire, you don't call for the household into the drawing room and debate the various options for escape for an hour, do you? It may have been all very well once, but the world's a complicated place now. The man in the street can't be expected to know enough about politics, economics, world commerce, and what have you. And why should he? In fact, you made a very good reply last night, Stevens. How did you put it? Something to the effect that it was not in your realm? Well, why should it be? It occurs to me, in recalling that these words, that of course many of Lord Darlington's ideas will seem today rather odd, even at times unattractive. But surely it cannot be denied that there is an important element of truth in these things that he said to me that morning in the billiard room. Of course, it is quite absurd to expect any butler to be in the position to answer authoritatively questions to the sort Mr. Spencer had put to me that night, and the claim of people like Mr. Harry Smith that night's dignity is conditional on being able to do so can be seen for the nonsense it is. Let us establish this quite clearly. A butler's duty is to provide good service. It is not to meddle in great affairs of the nation. The fact is, great such great affairs will always be beyond the understanding of those such as you and me, and those of us who wish to make our mark must realize that we best do so by concentrating on what is within our realm, that is to say, by devoting our attention to providing the best service to those great gentlemen in whose hands the destiny of civilization truly lies. This may seem obvious, but then one can immediately think of too many instances of butlers who, for a time anyway, thought quite differently. Indeed, Mr. Harry Smith's word tonight reminds me very much of the sort of misguided idealism which besets significant sections of our generation throughout the 20s and 30s. I refer to that strand of opinion in the profession which suggested that any butler with serious aspiration should make it his business to forever reappraising his employer, scrutinizing the latter's motives, analyzing in the implications of his views. Only in this way, so the argument ran, could one be so sure of one's skill were being employed to a desirable end. Although one sympathizes to some extent with the idealism contained in such argument, there can be little doubt that it is the result, like Mr. Smith's sentiments tonight, of misguided thinking. One need to look at the butlers who attempted to put such an approach into practice, and one will see that their careers, and in some cases they were highly promising careers, came to nothing as a direct consequence. I personally knew at least two professionals, both of some ability, who went from one employer to the next, forever dissatisfied, never settling anywhere until they drifted from the view altogether. That is, should happen, is not in the least surprising, for it is in practice simply not possible to adopt such a critical attitude towards an employer and at the same time provide good service. It is not simply that one is unlikely to be able to meet with the many demands of service at the higher levels while one's attention is being diverted by such matters. More fundamentally, a butler who is forever attempting to formulate his own strong opinions on his employer's on his employer's affair to be bound to lack one quality essential in good professionals, namely loyalty. Please do not misunderstand me here. I do not refer to the mindless sort of loyalty that mediocre employers bemoan the lack of when they find themselves unable to retain the services of high caliber professionals. Indeed, I would be among the last to advocate bestowing one's loyalty carelessly on any lady or gentleman who happened to employ one for a time. However, if a butler is to be worth to anything or anybody in life, there must be surely come a time when he ceases his searching, a time when he must say to himself that this employer embodies all that I find noble and admirable. I will thereafter devote myself to serving him. This is loyalty intelligently bestowed. What is there undignified in this? One is simply accepting inescapable truth that the likes of you and I will never be in a position to comprehend the great affairs of today's world, and our best course will always be to put our trust in an employer we judge to be wise and honorable, and to devote our energies to the task of serving him to the best of our ability. Look at the likes of Mr. Marshall, say, or Mr. Lane, surely two of the greatest figures in our profession. Can we imagine Mr. Marshall arguing with Lord Camberley over the latter's latest dispatch to the Foreign Office? Do we admire Mr. Lane any less because we learn that he is not in the habit of challenging Sir Leonard Grey before each speech in the House of Commons? Of course we do not. What is there undignified? What is there at all culpable in such attitude? How can one possibly be held to blame in any sense because, say, the passage of time has shown that Lord Darlington's efforts were misguided, even foolish? Throughout the years I served him, it was he and he alone who weighed up the evidence, and I judged it best to myself to proceed in the way he did, while I simply confined myself quite properly to affairs within my own professional realm. And as far as I am concerned, I carried out my duties to the best of my abilities. Indeed, to a standard which many may consider first rate. It is hardly my fault if his lordship's life and work have turned out today to look at best a sad waste, and it is quite illogical that I should feel any regret or shame on my own account. And ladies and gentlemen, that is where I'm going to end today's reading session. It also went on for quite long, but the last chapter is definitely really, really long. Hi. So we will continue tomorrow. No, sorry, not tomorrow. Sorry. We'll continue on Friday. We'll finish up the book on Friday, and then we'll have something new to read next week. Maybe next week. Maybe I'll take a break, but probably next week. Trying to stick to a schedule is like fucking difficult for me. I don't understand why. But I'm trying my best. I'm always trying my best. But thank you so much for Amaryllis for being here with me today, staying until the end of today's reading. Thank you for Fisella, also the best and cutest frog in the whole realm. And also Nagis, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, you guys. Oh, thank you, Atrera. Oh, you're here again, Atrera. Thank you so much. I would like to think today's reading is much better compared to Monday. Oh, thank you so much. Monday I was very nervous and I stuttered a lot. I stuttered a lot today too. I'm always stuttering because I always rush through my sentence because I'm silly. Oh, the yo dance is chicken dance now? I see. I mean, it makes sense. Thank you so much, Atrera. Thank you so much to my Holy Wing. Thank you, Deanne, for staying for so long until you left. Thank you to FPS02 for following the channel. Thank you to Silk Got Suspended. Oh, poor thing. For the follow. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Was it wholesome? The topic is not that wholesome though. It's very political. But it is Kazuo Ishiguro, so you McNugget. I was thinking maybe I would like raid a little today, but since the end is not here, I don't really like to raid without the end, so I'm just gonna chill in game today, I guess. But once again, everyone, thank you so much for attending my reading session today on a very boring and a boring Wednesday morning. But thank you so much for being here. We will finish up the book. Oh my god, my bird. We will finish up the book on this coming Friday. There's only like about 2 chapters left. It will be a shorter reading. So yeah. Thank you once again for being here with me. I'm gonna send you all off. I'm gonna go eat because I'm hungry. But I'm gonna send you all off with my favorite song in the world.
Have you ever had a dream that you could know, you could know, you want to know,
Thank you. I'm very happy to read to all of you.
Have you ever had a dream that you could know, you want to know,
Yes. I always have a dream. Thank you. I really like reading to you all. I hope I didn't bore you all, but you guys always can put my channel on the background while you're doing your dungeon roulettes or crafting gathering or whatever you guys are doing. I'm happy to entertain in one way or another. I really like reading. So reading to y'all is definitely something that I really, really enjoy, and I should do more often if I'm not lazy as fuck. But I'm always lazy. Hey, my birdie. Anyway, I'm hungry, so I'm gonna go eat. So I'll see you all soon. I might stream tomorrow. I don't know. I might stream tonight. Who knows? I might stream, but to finish up the remains of the day by Kazuo Ishiguro, we're gonna do it on this coming Friday morning, 11 a.m. GMT plus 8 as usual. So until then, have a nice Wednesday and have fun. I mean, I'm not promising anything for tonight, okay? Shh, 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 shh. Okay. Have a great day, all. I love y'all. Thank you for the follows. Thank you for the follows, and thank you for the sub. Uh, you guys are awesome. I'll see y'all soon, whenever the day comes. Bye. Thank you. Bye bye.